Hey everybody, this is Sleepy Crime, and today I'm gonna help you. I know you want to fall asleep to this video, so before you do, put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching? Make yourself comfortable and relax. Lauren Spearer was born on January 17, 1991, in Scarsdale, New York, to Robert and Charlene Spearer. Raised in a close-knit Jewish family, she grew up in an affluent suburb just north of New York City. Lauren's early life reflected warmth, involvement, and promise. She attended Edgemont High School, where she was known as a friendly, sociable, and outgoing student. Her small stature, standing barely 5 feet tall, belied an energetic personality and a wide circle of friends. After high school, Lauren enrolled at Indiana University in Bloomington to study textiles merchandising. The program was a strong fit for her passion for fashion, and she quickly found her place in the campus community. Lauren had a vibrant social life and was deeply engaged with campus events. Her friendship circle extended beyond her dorm and classroom to fellow students who shared her interests in fashion and nightlife. Lauren's college years were also marked by health challenges. She had a heart condition known as long QT syndrome, which required her to avoid certain medications and manage stress carefully. Despite this, she maintained an active lifestyle and participated in social activities, often going out with friends on weekends. During her time at Indiana University, Lauren became close with several students, including her boyfriend Jesse Wolfe. They were known to spend a great deal of time together, often seen at campus events and social gatherings. Lauren also forged connections with other students, including those living at 5 North Townhomes, a location that would later become significant in the timeline of her disappearance. The spring of 2011 saw Lauren preparing for a summer filled with plans. Her academic year was coming to a close, and she had recently completed her final exams. Bloomington, a city of around 80,000 people, had emptied out slightly as students began leaving for the break. Still, Lauren chose to remain in town a little longer, spending time with friends and enjoying the pause before returning to New York. On the night of June 2, 2011, Lauren joined a group of friends for a night out. That evening began like many others during her college years, filled with excitement, a sense of freedom, and the casual atmosphere of a typical college town. No one could have predicted that this night would mark the last time Lauren Spearer was seen. As the evening unfolded, Lauren moved through familiar places with people she knew well. The events of that night and the early morning hours of June 3rd would become the subject of intense investigation, public scrutiny, and enduring mystery. But before all of that, there was just Lauren, a young woman with dreams, friends, and a life in bloom. June 2, 2011 began as a typical summer evening for Lauren Spearer in Bloomington, Indiana. With the academic year concluded, she had more time to spend with friends. That night, Lauren made plans to go out with several acquaintances, most of whom were students or recent graduates from Indiana University. In the early evening, Lauren and her friend David Rohn attended a small party at her apartment complex. Around 12:30 a.m., she left with Corey Rossman, a fellow IU student who lived nearby at 5 North Townhomes. The two arrived at the townhome complex shortly afterward and spent time at Rossman's apartment, where a small group had gathered. Alcohol consumption was part of the evening's activities. At some point, Lauren removed her shoes and left her phone and purse behind, a decision that would later complicate efforts to track her movements. By 1:46 a.m., Lauren and Rossman walked to Kilroy's Sports Bar, a local establishment familiar to many IU students. Surveillance footage later confirmed their presence there, Lauren was seen wearing a white tank top and black leggings. At Kilroy's, she was spotted with Rossman and others, but she was asked to leave due to appearing too intoxicated. A staff member reportedly noticed she had lost her shoes, and she exited the bar barefoot. After being removed from Kilroy's, Lauren and Rossman returned to the apartment complex. At around 2:30 a.m., they were seen entering Smallwood Plaza, where Lauren lived. Surveillance footage recorded them entering the building, but there is no footage showing her entering her unit. Rossman appeared to be highly intoxicated. Inside the lobby, a confrontation reportedly took place between Rossman and a man identified as Lauren's friend and neighbor, Zach Oakes. Oakes, noticing Rossman's state, is said to have punched him in the face, causing a possible memory lapse or blackout. After the altercation, another individual, Michael Beth, who lived in the same complex as Rossman, became involved. He escorted Lauren back to Rossman's apartment. She was reportedly unsteady on her feet, and her condition was described by those present as severely intoxicated. Around 3:30 a.m., Michael Beth reported seeing Lauren leave the apartment alone. He claimed she intended to walk home, a distance of only a few blocks, although she had no shoes, phone, or keys. A neighbor later reported seeing a young woman matching Lauren's description walking alone near 11th Street and College Avenue around 4:15 a.m. This would be the last credible sighting of Lauren Spearer. The sequence of events between her last confirmed interactions and the reported sighting remains uncertain. Over the years, this window of roughly 1 hour between when Lauren was last seen at the apartment and when she allegedly walked off alone has become the focus of intense analysis and speculation. While her actions that night followed familiar social patterns for many students, her vulnerability, barefoot, without her phone, clearly intoxicated, rendered her exposed to risks she may not have fully understood in the moment. The night that began as just another gathering among friends was now veering into a disappearance that would grip a community and stretch into years without resolution. As the early morning hours of June 3, 2011, passed quietly over Bloomington, Indiana, Lauren Spearer vanished without a trace. By 4:30 a.m., she was no longer seen or heard from. No calls, no messages, no known attempts to return to her apartment. The disappearance became evident only later, when her absence could no longer be attributed to sleep or casual plans. At approximately noon, Lauren's boyfriend Jesse Wolfe became concerned. She had not returned messages and hadn't been seen since the previous night. He contacted her friends and then reached out to her parents. Robert and Charlene Spearer, alarmed, began coordinating with authorities. Lauren's family quickly traveled to Bloomington, initiating what would become an intensive and highly publicized search for their daughter. Bloomington police began gathering information from those last known to have seen Lauren. Interviews were conducted with Corey Rossman, Michael Beth, and others present that night. Each account was compared against surveillance footage, phone records, and any available witness statements. What emerged was a timeline marked by intoxication, fragmented memories, and limited physical evidence. Rossman, reportedly suffering memory loss due to the punch delivered at Smallwood Plaza, stated he had no recollection of parts of the night. Michael Beth claimed that after Lauren left his apartment around 4:30 a.m., she was alone. There was no indication of a struggle, no report of screams, and no immediate evidence to suggest where she had gone next. Investigators canvassed the surrounding area. Dogs trained in scent tracking were used to follow her path, but no definitive trail was found. Security cameras in the vicinity were reviewed, but no footage conclusively captured Lauren's movements after her last known sighting. Complicating matters further was the fact that Lauren had left behind her personal items: phone, purse, keys, and shoes. Without these, traditional methods of tracking or communication were ineffective. Her decision to walk off alone in such a vulnerable state became a focal point of concern and inquiry. By the end of that first day, missing person flyers had been distributed around campus and downtown Bloomington. Local news stations began reporting on the case, and social media posts spread rapidly. Friends and fellow students expressed disbelief that someone so familiar and well-liked could simply vanish in the heart of a college town. The initial theory considered was that Lauren might have been injured or suffered a medical emergency due to her known heart condition. Yet no trace of her was found, not even a piece of clothing or an eyewitness to her potential collapse. With no signs of voluntary departure and no apparent motive for vanishing, investigators began to consider foul play. As the hours turned to days, the urgency of the case deepened. Police increased patrols, questioned more students, and began combing through dumpsters and wooded areas nearby. Lauren's parents set up a base of operations in Bloomington and coordinated with volunteers. Despite extensive efforts, no conclusive evidence emerged to explain how or why Lauren Spearer disappeared. That morning, when Lauren stepped out into the night, barefoot and alone, would mark the last moment she was verifiably seen. Everything afterward, theories, witness statements, suspicions, remained tethered to those final minutes before silence fell. In the immediate aftermath of Lauren Spearer's disappearance, the community of Bloomington mobilized. What began as a college student missing after a night out rapidly evolved into one of the largest missing person searches in Indiana's history. Lauren's parents, Robert and Charlene Spearer, arrived in Bloomington swiftly, establishing a command post at the Smallwood Plaza where Lauren had lived. They coordinated closely with law enforcement, who began treating the case with high priority. Within days, the FBI and other federal agencies were brought in to support the Bloomington Police Department. Flyers with Lauren's photo, blonde hair, blue eyes, petite build, blanketed storefronts, lampposts, and bulletin boards. The family offered a reward, initially $100,000, later increasing it as weeks passed without resolution. Search parties, composed of volunteers and coordinated by local authorities, fanned out daily across the city. Students, residents, and even strangers joined efforts, combing parks, wooded areas, and abandoned buildings. Authorities used helicopters, cadaver dogs, infrared imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. Divers searched local lakes and rivers, including Griffey Lake. Waste collection sites were reviewed, and dumpsters in the area of her last known location were inspected. Despite the exhaustive efforts, no substantial leads surfaced. The search was methodical and comprehensive. Investigators reviewed hundreds of hours of surveillance footage from surrounding businesses and residential buildings. Cell phone data was analyzed, though Lauren's own device was left behind and never reactivated. Social media accounts were monitored for any sign of communication or new leads. The community support was substantial. A dedicated website and social media pages were created to disseminate updates. Celebrities and public figures, including athletes and entertainers, shared Lauren's story in hopes of generating new tips. Billboards with Lauren's image went up along highways across Indiana and neighboring states. As tips poured in from around the country, investigators sifted through every possible lead. Sightings of individuals matching Lauren's description were reported in other cities, but none were verified. The absence of physical evidence became a central frustration in the case. Her known acquaintances were re-interviewed. Questions persisted about the events of that night, particularly the period between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m. statements, given by those last seen with her, were closely scrutinized, but no charges were filed. All parties maintained they had no knowledge of what happened after Lauren left Rossman's apartment. Investigators also explored the possibility of abduction. Several known offenders in the area were investigated, but no connection to Lauren's case was established. Security at IU was increased temporarily, and students were advised to avoid walking alone at night. As days turned into weeks, hope faded that Lauren had simply wandered off or was hiding. The search effort never stopped, but its nature changed. What began as a rescue mission shifted toward recovery. The Spearer family remained in Bloomington for months, holding daily press briefings and urging anyone with information to come forward. Despite the scope and intensity of the search, Lauren's disappearance remained unresolved. Each exhaustive effort added to the weight of the mystery. The absence of answers compounded the grief of her family and the frustration of investigators. The question persisted: how could someone vanish so completely from a familiar place, in a span of minutes, in a town filled with cameras, witnesses, and concern? As the weeks following Lauren Spearer's disappearance turned into months, the Bloomington Police Department expanded their investigative scope. Hundreds of leads had been collected, but few provided actionable information. The timeline established by early witness statements remained central, yet gaps in that timeline continued to frustrate investigators. Detectives revisited those last seen with Lauren, particularly Corey Rossman and Michael Beth. Rossman's claim of memory loss due to a punch received at Smallwood Plaza presented a challenge. His recollection of the evening was fragmentary, and no verifiable information emerged from his account beyond what surveillance footage already confirmed. Michael Beth maintained that Lauren had left his apartment voluntarily around 4:30 a.m., barefoot and alone. Neither individual was ever charged, and both cooperated with law enforcement through legal representation. Investigators also questioned Jesse Wolfe, Lauren's boyfriend, and examined his communications and whereabouts. He had not been with Lauren the night she vanished and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. His cooperation was described as full and immediate. Authorities focused on building a profile of Lauren's last hour from 3:30 a.m. onward. They mapped a 3-block radius between the 5 North townhomes and her residence at Smallwood Plaza. Despite extensive canvassing and forensic sweeps of that area, no definitive evidence was recovered. No clothing, DNA, or personal items. Digital forensic specialists attempted to extract data from social media and text messages. While they pieced together parts of Lauren's communications earlier in the night, nothing after 2:51 a.m. was retrieved that clarified her fate. Her phone remained powered off, and attempts to locate it using GPS or pinging cell towers yielded no result. The FBI profiled known offenders in the region and evaluated whether a local predator could be responsible. Several individuals were interrogated, including persons with histories of violence or abduction, but no connections were established. Authorities looked into similar disappearances in nearby towns, but none matched the circumstances or timeline of Lauren's case. In early stages, police executed search warrants on several properties. Rossman's apartment, as well as other locations frequented by those with Lauren that night, were searched. Items were collected for testing, but no conclusive forensic evidence was ever made public. Over time, tensions developed between the Spearer family and some of Lauren's acquaintances. The family voiced frustrations about individuals refusing to take polygraph tests administered by police and instead opting for private ones. This decision, while not illegal, generated public suspicion and fueled speculation. The lack of transparency around the events of that night further complicated the public's understanding. In an attempt to maintain momentum, police established a tip line and released new statements at regular intervals. They received information ranging from detailed theories to vague leads. Some tips alleged Lauren had died accidentally and that witnesses concealed her body. Others proposed abduction scenarios involving passing motorists or strangers. Each theory required time and resources to investigate. Still, none yielded physical proof. Cadaver dogs were brought back months later for follow-up searches in woods and areas near construction sites. Drainage systems and sewers were rechecked. The physical effort continued long after media interest had begun to decline. Despite the silence and scarcity of evidence, law enforcement emphasized that the case remained active. Detectives continued working with federal agencies and following up on every new lead. The investigation, while stalled in public perception, never officially went cold. By the end of the first year, the unanswered questions remained largely the same. How did a well-known student disappear in such a short span of time, within blocks of her home, without anyone seeing or hearing anything definitive? And why had no one come forward with a credible account? By 2013, 2 years after Lauren Spearer's disappearance, the absence of criminal charges and the lack of physical evidence left her family with few options to seek accountability. The investigative process had produced leads, but no definitive conclusions. Faced with limited avenues, the Spearer family took a significant legal step by filing a civil lawsuit in Monroe County against two individuals, Corey Rossman and Jason J. Rosenbaum, two of the last people known to have seen Lauren alive. The lawsuit alleged negligence. The Spearers claimed that both men had a legal and moral responsibility to ensure Lauren's safety, given her intoxicated state. They asserted that their failure to act appropriately contributed to her disappearance. Specifically, the complaint detailed how Lauren was visibly impaired, barefoot, and without her phone or personal belongings, factors that should have alerted those around her to her vulnerability. Rossman and Rosenbaum, through their attorneys, denied the allegations and moved to dismiss the lawsuit. They argued that the events of the night did not meet the legal standard of duty required to hold them liable for what followed. They maintained that Lauren left Rosenbaum's apartment of her own volition, and that no evidence indicated they had harmed her or failed to render appropriate aid. Over time, the lawsuit encountered legal hurdles. One of the central challenges was the absence of a definitive explanation for what happened to Lauren after she was last seen. Without knowledge of the cause or manner of her disappearance, the court faced difficulty establishing liability. The defense emphasized the speculative nature of the claims and the lack of direct evidence tying their clients to any wrongdoing. In 2014, a federal judge dismissed the suit. The ruling stated that while the circumstances were tragic, the facts presented did not satisfy the legal threshold for negligence under Indiana law. The decision underscored the difficulties families face when civil actions are pursued in the absence of criminal convictions or substantial forensic evidence. For the Spearer family, the lawsuit was never just about legal redress. It was also a means of compelling transparency. Throughout the investigation, they had expressed frustration with the perceived lack of cooperation from key individuals. While those named in the suit had cooperated with police initially, the family believed that private polygraphs and limited disclosures hindered the investigation. Despite the dismissal, the case served to refocus public attention on Lauren's disappearance. It reignited media interest and once again raised questions about the responsibilities of individuals in such scenarios. Could intervention by friends have changed the outcome? Should bystanders bear some legal obligation when witnessing vulnerability? The Spearers continued to advocate for awareness and for increased efforts in missing person cases. They participated in interviews, appeared at awareness events, and kept pressure on the investigation through public appeals. Although the lawsuit did not yield the outcome they had hoped for, it remained a significant component in their pursuit of answers. The legal route, while closed in the civil arena, left open continued efforts to seek justice through law enforcement. The family maintained their cooperation with investigators and continued to urge anyone with knowledge of that night to come forward. By this point, the disappearance of Lauren Spearer had become more than a local case. It was now a benchmark for how communities, authorities, and courts handle the complex territory between disappearance and accountability. With no arrests, no confirmed sightings, and no physical evidence, Lauren Spearer's case became fertile ground for public theories and speculation. Over time, several dominant explanations emerged, each rooted in differing interpretations of the known timeline, behaviors of witnesses, and the context of that night. One of the earliest and most enduring theories posited that Lauren died accidentally due to alcohol or drug use, and that those with her panicked and concealed her body. This theory pointed to the level of intoxication described by witnesses and suggested the possibility that she could have suffered a fatal overdose. Supporters of this theory noted the decision by some individuals to hire legal representation quickly and avoid police-administered polygraphs, suggesting a possible desire to protect themselves. However, no toxicology reports or evidence ever confirmed this scenario, and no confessions or physical remains supported it. Another theory centered on the possibility of abduction. According to this view, Lauren, vulnerable, intoxicated, and walking alone, may have been taken by an opportunistic offender. The early morning hours of June 3rd provided a narrow window, but with few people on the streets, it remained possible that a passing motorist or predator targeted her. Investigators considered known offenders in the area, reviewed sex offender registries, and examined other missing person cases for patterns. None offered a definitive link. A third theory speculated that Lauren was struck by a vehicle, possibly accidentally, and that the driver concealed the accident. Given her lack of visibility and the fact that she was walking barefoot in the dark, this scenario was considered plausible. Searches along roads and vehicle forensics were conducted, but no damaged vehicles or physical traces consistent with a hit-and-run were found. In contrast, a small but persistent thread of speculation suggested voluntary disappearance. This theory posited that Lauren may have chosen to walk away or escape from something in her life, her personal items being left behind, and her medical condition, however, made this scenario unlikely. Those closest to her strongly rejected the idea, citing her academic plans, family connections, and social attachments. Online forums and amateur investigators develop theories of their own, often based on circumstantial evidence or speculative reasoning. The case became widely discussed in true crime communities, where each detail was parsed, debated, and reinterpreted. While some public attention helped keep the case in focus, the proliferation of unsupported theories also generated misinformation and, at times, hindered the investigation. The Spearer family, while welcoming public interest, consistently called for restraint and fact-based discussion. They emphasized that only verifiable information could contribute to solving the case, and the speculation, especially when accusatory, caused additional pain. Law enforcement reviewed and re-reviewed each theory. They stated that while no scenario could be ruled out completely, none had been confirmed with evidence. The investigation remained open, and leads continued to be followed, but each path ended in uncertainty. The absence of a body, witnesses, or clear forensic clues meant the case resisted resolution. Each theory carried elements of plausibility and gaps that prevented closure. Over the years, the weight of speculation became a part of the story itself, an ever-present cloud of possibility, each explanation as unconfirmed as the last. Ultimately, the continued speculation revealed as much about the human need for resolution as it did about the case. In the vacuum left by unanswered questions, the theories served as both a search for truth and a reminder of the elusive nature of it. More than a decade has passed since Lauren Spearer disappeared into the quiet streets of Bloomington, Indiana. Though the intensity of the media spotlight has dimmed, the efforts to find answers have not stopped. For her family, law enforcement, and a dedicated segment of the public, the search continues. Lauren's parents, Robert and Charlene Spearer, have remained active in advocating for their daughter and for other families of missing persons. Their work has kept Lauren's case in the public eye far beyond its initial news cycle. Through interviews, community events, and public statements, they have called for transparency, accountability, and continued investigation. Their message has remained steady. Someone knows what happened to Lauren, and silence will not bring resolution. The Bloomington Police Department has maintained that Lauren's case is open and active. A detective remains assigned to review leads as they come in, and investigators continue to analyze any new tips or technological avenues that may offer insight. Despite the passage of time, no statute of limitations applies to the case. Advances in forensic science, changes in testimony, or new evidence could still shift the direction of the investigation. In subsequent years, various law enforcement agencies have occasionally renewed searches in connection with tips, including excavations of properties and reviews of previously checked areas. Each time, the announcements reignite public interest and raise hopes, but so far, none have uncovered decisive answers. The legacy of Lauren Spearer has also taken shape in broader ways. Her disappearance prompted universities, student organizations, and local governments to increase awareness around safety, especially for young people in college towns. Programs promoting bystander intervention, personal security, and safe socializing environments have cited Lauren's case as a catalyst for change. Online, dedicated platforms continue to share updates, maintain visibility, and encourage community involvement. Supporters across the country have kept her story alive through social media campaigns and digital memorials. Anniversaries of her disappearance often see renewed attention, with reminders that justice remains unfulfilled. Lauren's family has also supported legislation aimed at improving responses to missing person cases. Their experience navigating law enforcement, legal systems, and media coverage has informed policy discussions on how such cases are handled, especially when they involve vulnerable or intoxicated individuals. Despite the long silence, the emotional urgency remains. The Spearer family has made clear that they do not seek vengeance. They seek truth. Their appeals, while unwavering, are grounded in realism. They acknowledge that answers may come gradually, through courage or circumstance, and not in a dramatic revelation. Yet they persist. What happened to Lauren Spearer remains a question without resolution. The night of June 3rd, 2011, left behind a void, not only in a timeline, but in the lives of those who loved her. Each day that passes without closure deepens the complexity of that void, but does not diminish the will to uncover the truth. Lauren's case stands as a testament to the enduring strength of a family's search for justice, the limits of investigative tools without evidence, and the haunting reality that sometimes, even in a world filled with data, cameras, and voices, a person can still vanish. Jody Sue Heisentrout was born on June 5, 1968, in Long Prairie, a small town nestled in central Minnesota. She was the youngest of three daughters raised by Imogene Huizentrout after the death of their father. From an early age, Jody exhibited a tenacity and energy that would define much of her later life. In school, she participated in multiple sports, particularly excelling at golf, a passion that remained with her into adulthood. Jody's interest in journalism began during her time at St. Cloud State University, where she majored in mass communications. She was known for her work ethic, enthusiasm, and determination to succeed in the competitive field of broadcast news. Her professors and classmates recalled her as ambitious, often staying late to perfect her stories, and willing to take on any assignment that would build her experience. After graduation, Jody began her broadcasting career in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at KGAN-TV, where she worked as a producer. She later moved to Alexandria, Minnesota, to work as a reporter and anchor at KSAX-TV. Her talent and charisma in front of the camera soon earned her a new opportunity, an on-air position as a morning news anchor at KIMT-TV in Mason City, Iowa. Mason City became her home, and viewers quickly grew to appreciate her bright demeanor and professionalism. At KIMT-TV, she took on the early morning shift, anchoring the news at 6 a.m., which required her to arrive at the station by around 3:30 a.m. Despite the grueling schedule, Jody's on-screen presence was consistently upbeat, earning her a strong following among local audiences. She immersed herself in the community, taking part in civic events and maintaining an active social life. By 1995, she was well established at the station and was considering future moves in her career, possibly to a larger market. Friends noted that she appeared to be both reflective and optimistic, keeping a personal journal that documented her thoughts and aspirations. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, she had spoken with colleagues and friends about her ambitions and the possibility of change, though there was no indication of immediate plans to leave Mason City. Professionally, she was respected, and personally, she was seen as energetic and generous. This chapter of her life, filled with promise and momentum, would stand in stark contrast to the shocking events that followed. As the calendar turned to late June 1995, no one could have anticipated that Jody's rising trajectory would be interrupted so abruptly and mysteriously. June 26, 1995, began like many summer days for Jody Huizentrout, busy, social, and filled with plans. The weather in Mason City was pleasant, and Jody had signed up to play in a local charity golf tournament, a favorite pastime that brought her both relaxation and camaraderie. She participated in the tournament alongside friends and acquaintances, and according to those who saw her that day, she was in good spirits. She laughed easily, posed for photos, and spoke casually about her work and upcoming events. After the golf outing, Jody returned home to prepare for the evening. She had accepted an invitation from John Von Cease, a friend more than 2 decades her senior, to stop by his residence. Von Cease, who often spoke of Jody with admiration, had recently hosted a birthday party for her and had recorded some of it on videotape. That evening, they watched the footage together. The gathering was reportedly low-key, with no evidence of tension or discomfort. Von Cease later stated that Jody left his home before 8 p.m. Jody's return to her apartment at the Key Apartments complex on North Kentucky Avenue would mark the last time she was seen by someone she knew. The night was unremarkable in outward appearance. There were no reports of distress or disturbances. Jody's red Mazda Miata was parked in its usual spot, and her evening likely followed her standard routine in preparation for the early morning news broadcast. She was expected to wake up before 3 a.m. the next morning to get ready for her anchor shift at Kimchi TV. Like many days before, she would have needed to be at the studio by 3:30 a.m. to prepare for the 6 a.m. newscast. Her co-workers had no reason to believe anything would disrupt the familiar rhythm she had maintained for months. Yet, the otherwise ordinary activities of June 26th would soon gain a new weight in hindsight. Every movement, every conversation, and every moment of that day would later be examined in the hope of understanding what led to Jody's unexplained disappearance. As the day came to a quiet end and night settled over Mason City, no one could have predicted that the next morning would bring a mystery that would persist for decades. The morning of June 27, 1995, began with a break in routine at Kimchi TV. Jody Huizentrout, known for her punctuality, was not at the station by 4 a.m. Amy Kunz, a producer, tried calling Jody's apartment. Around 4:10 a.m., Jody answered. She sounded groggy and said she had overslept, but was on her way to the studio. It was the last known conversation she would have. Minutes passed, then hours. By 7 a.m., it was clear something was wrong. Jody never arrived. Concerned co-workers contacted the Mason City Police Department, who responded to her apartment complex later that morning. What they found suggested a struggle had taken place. Jody's red Mazda Miata was still parked outside her apartment. Her belongings, including a red high heel, a blow dryer, earrings, and a bottle of hairspray, were scattered nearby. Her key was found bent in the door, as if someone had forcibly removed it during an altercation. The car's interior showed no signs of theft or forced entry. Police secured the scene and began canvassing the area. Several residents reported hearing a scream around 4:30 a.m., but no one had witnessed a confrontation. Others mentioned seeing a white van in the parking lot during the early morning hours, though descriptions were vague and inconsistent. There were no signs that Jody had left of her own accord. Her clothes, purse, and other personal items were untouched inside her apartment. Her on-air script and jewelry for the day's broadcast were ready, left behind as if she had been interrupted before completing her preparations. Officers cordoned off the parking area and started collecting evidence. A palm print was lifted from her vehicle. The FBI and Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation were called in to assist. The case quickly escalated in urgency and profile. Mason City, typically quiet and low crime, had never seen a disappearance like this. By late afternoon, police held a press conference announcing that Jody Huizentrout was officially missing and that foul play was suspected. News crews from surrounding states began arriving in Mason City. Kimchi TV, the station where Jody worked, became a central focus of the story it had never intended to report. As daylight faded on June 27th, the local community began organizing. Flyers were printed, searches were planned, but for all the growing attention, no definitive leads had emerged. Jody had vanished within a narrow window of time in a populated area, with no eyewitnesses and minimal forensic evidence. The hours of that morning, when Jody was supposed to be driving to work, reading the news, and continuing her routine, were now the focus of a criminal investigation that would span decades. In the immediate aftermath of Jody Huizentrout's disappearance, Mason City Police launched a full-scale investigation. Officers scoured the parking lot of the key apartments, looking for any signs that might point to what had occurred in the early morning hours of June 27th. What they found pointed to a sudden and violent struggle. A set of personal items, shoes, a hair dryer, a can of hairspray, and a set of earrings, was discovered near Jody's red Mazda Miata. The items were not scattered far from the driver's side door, suggesting they had fallen during a brief confrontation. The bent car key, still in the driver's side lock, raised concerns that Jody may have been attacked just as she attempted to unlock the door. One of the most critical pieces of early evidence was a partial palm print found on the Miata. While fingerprint analysis was initiated, no immediate match could be made, and the print would remain unidentified for years. Investigators also took note of drag marks in the gravel, which indicated that Jody may have been forcibly taken from the scene. Witness interviews from residents in the apartment complex added layers to the timeline. Multiple neighbors reported hearing a scream around 4:30 a.m., roughly 20 minutes after Jody had spoken with her producer. A few mentioned seeing a white van in the parking lot during that time, but accounts varied, and no license plate information was recorded. Despite the lead, authorities were unable to locate the van or confirm its involvement. The Mason City Police Department quickly partnered with the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation and the FBI. Law enforcement officers conducted door-to-door interviews and began reviewing surveillance footage from nearby businesses. Unfortunately, the area around the apartment complex lacked any cameras capable of capturing the incident. Friends, family, and co-workers were questioned in the first 48 hours. Jody's apartment was examined for signs of forced entry. None were found. Her day-to-day life was analyzed for clues: who she had spoken with, who had visited her recently, and whether anyone had expressed unwanted interest in her. One point of concern that emerged was a previous incident in which Jody had mentioned feeling like she was being followed, though she hadn't filed a police report. Despite the urgency of the search and the breadth of the early investigation, few solid leads emerged. Volunteers began organizing search parties to comb through nearby fields, parks, and wooded areas. Officers followed up on dozens of tips, but none led to a break in the case. As hours turned into days, national media attention began to focus on the story. The disappearance of a young, well-known news anchor from her apartment complex without a trace gripped the public imagination. Yet, even as resources expanded and more agencies joined the case, the investigation faced the harsh reality of limited evidence. The early stages of the investigation had established that a crime had almost certainly occurred. Jody had been taken against her will, likely by someone familiar with her schedule and movements. But beyond that, authorities were left with questions that had no immediate answers, and a community that had just begun to grapple with a deep sense of unease. In the days following Jody Huizentrout's disappearance, the city of Mason City mobilized in force. As law enforcement worked around the clock to track down leads, local residents began organizing search parties. Volunteers gathered at various locations around the city, preparing to comb through rural areas, parks, fields, and ditches in hopes of finding any trace of the missing anchor. Cerro Gordo County became the focal point for these efforts. Search grids were drawn, and hundreds of people participated, walking shoulder to shoulder through wooded areas and farmland. Orange flags and ribbon markers were used to identify areas of interest. At the same time, boats and dive teams checked local rivers and lakes, though no evidence linked to the case surfaced. The intensity of the effort drew national media attention. News vans lined the streets near Jody's apartment and the KIMT TV station. Her face appeared in newspapers across the country and on television programs dedicated to missing persons. Calls flooded in from viewers who believed they had seen someone matching Jody's description or who had theories about what happened. Law enforcement tracked every lead, but none yielded results. Friends and family appeared in interviews, appealing directly to the public for help. Jody's mother, Imogene Huizentrout, remained a steady public voice of hope, thanking searchers and pleading for any information. The community responded with vigils and prayer services, Posters and flyers bearing Jody's image and the words "missing" and "help bring Jody home" were placed on storefronts, telephone poles, and bulletin boards. Private investigators were brought in to assist, and psychics reached out to offer their impressions of what might have occurred. Some volunteers searched areas suggested by these tips, though law enforcement maintained focus on verifiable leads. At the time, the public enthusiasm was seen as both a strength and a challenge, raising awareness while also generating thousands of potential but unconfirmed sightings and tips. Investigators tried to reconstruct the timeline of Jody's final hours with every detail. Re-interviews were conducted with friends and acquaintances. Her telephone records were reviewed. The KIMT TV station worked with police to understand her work habits and identify anyone who might have known her schedule. Despite the intensity of the effort, no substantial breakthrough emerged. As the weeks passed, the community faced a sobering reality. The initial momentum was slowing and the trail was growing cold. Yet even as the daily search efforts began to wind down, the desire for resolution remained. Media interest continued, with segments on national programs such as America's Most Wanted and Unsolved Mysteries. These broadcasts brought new attention and renewed waves of tips, but again, no critical lead. By the end of the summer of 1995, the broad search had been narrowed and the case began to shift from an active recovery effort to a longer-term investigation. The absence of physical evidence or a clear suspect left investigators with more questions than answers. Still, the community, her colleagues, and her family refused to let the story fade. The hope remained that somewhere, someone knew something, that a piece of information might yet surface to explain what had happened to Jody Huisentruit. As investigators expanded their inquiry into Jody Huisentrut's personal and professional circles, one individual soon stood out, John Von Cease, a friend of Jody's who had spent time with her the night before her disappearance. At 49 years old, Van Cease was over 20 years her senior. He had met Jody through community events and developed a close friendship with her. To some of her acquaintances, his attention appeared intense. Van Cease told police that Jody had visited his home on the evening of June 26, 1995. According to his account, she came over to watch a videotape of a surprise party he had hosted for her 27th birthday earlier that month. He stated that Jody left his home before 8 p.m. and that he had no contact with her afterward. He maintained that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Investigators questioned Von Cease extensively. His name became widely known in connection to the case, though law enforcement did not publicly label him a suspect. They collected evidence, examined his timeline, and sought to determine whether his version of events could be independently verified. Years passed without any formal charges or public developments concerning Van Cease. However, interest in his role never disappeared. In 2017, over 2 decades after the disappearance, court records revealed that investigators had obtained a search warrant for GPS data related to Van Cease's vehicles. The documents indicated that police believed he was one of the last people to see Jody alive. The warrant also mentioned statements attributed to Von Cease that raised questions, comments he allegedly made suggesting knowledge of the case that had not been publicly released. Despite these developments, no charges were brought against him, and the data obtained from the devices did not lead to a resolution. Van Cease continued to deny involvement and relocated from Iowa to Arizona, where he lived until his death in December 2024. His passing closed a chapter in the investigation that had remained unresolved for nearly 30 years. Although Van Cease had never been officially charged and no physical evidence conclusively tied him to the disappearance, he remained a central figure in the narrative, one who knew Jodi well and had been among the last to see her. The attention surrounding Von Cease underscored the frustrations of the case, years of leads that ended without answers, and individuals connected to the story who were left under a cloud of suspicion. Law enforcement continued to examine other possibilities, but the focus on Von Cease highlighted how closely the investigation centered on Jodi's inner circle and the final hours before she vanished. As time progressed, the question lingered. Had Jodi confided in someone about her concerns? Had someone close to her betrayed her trust? The answers remained elusive, even as scrutiny of Von Cease's role persisted in the public consciousness. The years following Jodi Heisentrut's disappearance were marked by enduring public interest, periodic investigative efforts, and the unrelenting determination of her family and friends to keep her case alive. While the trail remained cold, new developments emerged sporadically, each one raising hopes that a resolution might be within reach. In 2008, a mysterious development drew attention when Jodi's personal journal was mailed anonymously to a local newspaper. The journal, long thought to be among her missing possessions, contained handwritten entries reflecting her thoughts and ambitions in the months before her disappearance. Its sudden reappearance prompted renewed examination. Authorities traced the journal's chain of custody and confirmed it had been previously held by law enforcement, suggesting the mailing was not the result of new evidence, but rather an unexplained act of recirculation. Public interest in the case was further sustained by legislation, inspired in part by Jodi's story. Lawmakers and advocacy groups pushed for reforms in how missing persons cases were handled, particularly involving adults. These efforts led to policy changes in record keeping, information sharing, and the urgency with which missing adult cases were addressed in Iowa and other states. In 2003, a group of journalists and investigators founded a website dedicated to Jodi's case, findjodi.com. It served as a central repository for case information, media coverage, and tips. The site attracted amateur sleuths, retired law enforcement officials, and former reporters who joined in the effort to collect and analyze data. Over time, findjodi.com evolved into an informal task force, offering rewards, posting updates, and releasing previously unreleased case materials. Volunteers associated with the site installed billboards in Mason City and surrounding areas, displaying Jodi's face alongside a simple message: "Someone knows something." The billboards served as both a tribute and a challenge, reminding the public that the case remained unsolved. Over the decades, advances in forensic science and digital investigation offered new possibilities. Law enforcement reviewed cold cases, cross-referenced DNA databases, and explored technological tools unavailable in the 1990s. These methods were applied to Jodi's case as well, though no match or breakthrough resulted. Interest in the case continued to be fueled by documentaries, podcast episodes, and media retrospectives. Reporters returned to Mason City each anniversary, interviewing those closest to Jodi and highlighting the timeline of events. Her colleagues at KMT-TV remained vocal about their loss, occasionally producing tribute segments in her memory. Despite the absence of an arrest or confirmed sighting, the search for truth never stopped. Each small development, whether a legislative change, an anonymous tip, or a recovered item, was a reminder that the case had not been forgotten. For those closest to Jodi, the passage of time only deepened the sense of urgency. The belief persisted that someone still held the key to unlocking what had happened on that summer morning in 1995, and that the truth might yet surface. As the decades passed, the mystery of Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance continued to weigh heavily on her hometown, her colleagues, and the broader community of those who followed her case. Despite the passage of time, the pursuit of answers never stopped. Law enforcement agencies have consistently reiterated their commitment to solving the case. The Mason City Police Department has kept the investigation active, regularly reviewing evidence and reevaluating leads. While resources and staffing have changed over the years, the case has never been officially closed. Investigators have stated that the smallest detail could still unlock the truth, and they have maintained a policy of following up on every credible tip. Annually, remembrance events are held in Mason City. These gatherings bring together family, friends, and supporters to reflect on Jodi's life and to renew public attention on the unresolved case. Moments of silence, candlelight vigils, and words from those who knew her serve as reminders that Jodi was more than a headline. She was a daughter, a colleague, and a community member. Organizations like FindJodi.com continue to play a key role in these efforts. The site publishes case updates, provides a platform for tip submissions, and fosters discussion about new developments. Its mission remains consistent: to find Jodi and to ensure her disappearance is never forgotten. One of the central frustrations of the case has been the lack of conclusive evidence or a suspect. While numerous individuals have been interviewed and multiple theories explored, the investigation remains without charges or definitive answers. Technological advances have helped law enforcement revisit forensic evidence with greater precision, yet so far, no discovery has led to a resolution. The case has also had an impact on the journalism community. Jodi's disappearance prompted renewed discussions about safety for reporters, particularly those working irregular hours or in isolated environments. Newsrooms across the country have cited her case when developing workplace safety protocols. Public appeals remain a crucial part of the investigation. Authorities continue to ask that anyone with information, no matter how minor it may seem, come forward. The belief persists that someone knows what happened or witnessed something that, if properly understood, could bring clarity to a case that has long defied explanation. As of the 30th anniversary, the file on Jodi Huisentruit's disappearance remains open. Her story is still told, her image still circulated, and the questions still asked. What happened in the early morning hours of June 27th, 1995? Who was responsible? And will justice ever be achieved? The ongoing quest for answers continues not just out of obligation, but from the enduring hope that someday the truth will emerge, and that Jodi's story will finally have an ending. Catasauqua, a small borough in Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley, was home to Joanne Marie O'Connor Katrinac and her husband, Andrew Katrinac. In the early 1990s, the couple lived a modest life in a quiet residential neighborhood, surrounded by family and a tight-knit community. Joanne, born in 1968, had a warm and outgoing personality. She was known for her strong work ethic and deep dedication to her family. After marrying Andrew in 1993, she embraced her new role as a wife and soon as a mother. Joanne and Andrew's relationship began after his previous relationship with Patricia Rohrer, a woman he had dated before meeting Joanne. While the past connection was known, it seemed to have little impact on Joanne and Andrew's new life together. They settled into their home in Catasauqua and welcomed their son, Alex, in 1994. The couple was reportedly happy, adjusting to life with a newborn while planning for their future. Neighbors described Joanne as a loving and attentive mother. She took pride in caring for her son and maintaining their household, Her days were filled with the routines of early motherhood, feedings, nappies, and the small joys that came with watching Alex grow. Andrew worked to support the family, and although life presented the usual challenges of young parenthood, there were no outward signs of trouble. The couple often visited Joanne's family, sharing meals and family time. Joanne's parents were especially close to their daughter and grandson, reinforcing the family-oriented structure that defined her life. It was a period marked by simplicity and hope, the quiet rhythm of domestic life, full of anticipation for what the future might bring. But beneath this peaceful surface, a darker thread was about to unravel. What began as an ordinary winter day in December 1994 would soon disrupt their world forever. Joanne's disappearance would lead to a complex investigation that would stretch over years, bringing attention not only to the quiet streets of Catasauqua, but to questions about justice, memory, and the reliability of forensic science. On the afternoon of December 15, 1994, a typical winter day in Catasauqua turned ominous. Joanne Katranak was expected to meet her cousin for a shopping trip. She had made a phone call around midday to confirm her plans, but never arrived. Concern quickly mounted when neither she nor 4-month-old Alex could be reached. Calls went unanswered, and as night fell, worry deepened. Andrew Katranak returned home from work to find the house empty. What caught his attention immediately was the open front door and the lights left on. Inside, Joanne's coat was missing, as was Alex's diaper bag and car seat. But Joanne's purse remained, and their family car, a 1986 Chevrolet, was not in the driveway. It appeared she had left in a hurry. There were no signs of a struggle in the house, but something felt wrong. Andrew contacted Joanne's family, hoping she might have visited them unexpectedly. No one had seen her. By that evening, he contacted the police. A missing persons report was filed, and a preliminary search was launched. Authorities initially considered various possibilities. Perhaps Joanne had gone to visit a friend or needed a break. But as hours turned into days, the case grew more serious. On December 16th, Joanne's car was found abandoned near a remote trailhead outside of town. The vehicle appeared intact. Inside, investigators found a few personal belongings, but no clear signs of foul play. The positioning of the seat and other small details indicated someone other than Joanne might have driven it last. There was no trace of the infant or his mother. The disappearance shocked the community. Flyers were distributed with photographs of Joanne and Alex. Police conducted interviews, retraced Joanne's last known steps, and searched nearby wooded areas. Volunteers joined in the effort, driven by the urgency of a missing mother and her baby in the cold Pennsylvania winter. Detectives began constructing a timeline. Joanne's last confirmed contact was her midday phone call. After that, there were no credit card transactions, no confirmed sightings, and no phone activity. The absence of leads frustrated investigators. There was no evidence pointing to a car accident, robbery, or voluntary disappearance. The scenario increasingly pointed to abduction. Attention turned to individuals close to Joanne. Her husband was questioned extensively, as was routine, and his alibi was confirmed. Friends and acquaintances were contacted. Among those interviewed was Patricia Rohrer, Andrew's former girlfriend, who lived in North Carolina. At the time, the inquiry into Rohrer was limited. She claimed to have not been in Pennsylvania in months. Despite extensive search efforts and media coverage, winter deepened with no answers. Each passing week strained hopes for a safe return. While the investigation continued, uncertainty and fear cast a long shadow over the once quiet borough. As December gave way to January, the search for Joanne Katranak and her infant son Alex intensified. Local authorities coordinated with state and federal agencies, deploying search teams across Lehigh and surrounding counties. Snow blanketed much of the terrain, complicating efforts to track any potential route Joanne might have taken or been taken on. Canine units combed wooded areas, and helicopters scanned from above, but day after day passed with no trace. Community members rallied. Volunteers distributed missing persons posters in neighboring towns. Local churches organized prayer vigils. Tips poured in from across the region, but none yielded a breakthrough. The image of Joanne, smiling, holding her baby, became a fixture on television news segments and storefront windows. Investigators re-examined the details. They believe Joanne had likely left her home willingly with the baby, possibly responding to a knock at the door or a familiar voice. The absence of struggle inside the house reinforced that theory. However, the abruptness of her departure and the subsequent silence raised concerns that she had been lured or forced into a situation she could not escape. Andrew Katranak continued to work closely with law enforcement. He endured repeated interviews and polygraph tests, all of which supported his account. His emotional appeals and press conferences added urgency to the case. Yet, as days turned into weeks, the pressure mounted. The lack of physical evidence, the missing mother, the untouched car, the lack of witnesses, frustrated investigators and left the public anxious. January and February passed without development. Despite freezing temperatures, searchers returned repeatedly to areas around where Joanne's car had been found. Forensic analysis of the vehicle produced limited results. No fingerprints of value, no blood, and no clear signs of what had happened. The only item of interest was the way the seat had been moved, inconsistent with Joanne's height and driving position. In March, the FBI became more actively involved. They conducted interviews across state lines, including in North Carolina. Their profile suggested the abduction might have been planned and carried out by someone known to Joanne or Andrew. Suspicion grew toward individuals from Andrew's past, especially Patricia Rohrer, whose name appeared in multiple conversations. At that time, however, no direct link could be made. The psychological toll on the Katranak family was immense. Joanne's parents appeared on local television, pleading for any information. They remained hopeful, holding on to the belief that Joanne and Alex might be alive somewhere. Law enforcement encouraged the public to report anything, no matter how minor. Still, the leads dwindled and the case grew colder. By April, nearly 4 months had passed. No calls, no sightings, and no definitive clues left authorities with little to go on. Then, unexpectedly, a discovery in rural Heidelberg Township would change everything. On April 9, 1995, nearly 4 months after Joanne and Alex Katranak vanished, a grim discovery was made in a remote section of Heidelberg Township, about 15 miles from Catasauqua. A man walking his dog noticed a pile of debris at the edge of a trail, partially covered by brush and fallen branches. Closer inspection revealed the decomposed remains of an adult woman and a small child. Law enforcement cordoned off the area immediately. Forensic teams arrived and began methodically documenting the scene. The woman's body was found face down, bound with rope, with clear signs of blunt force trauma to the head. Her clothing was intact, though weathered by the elements. Nearby, the remains of a baby were located, lying a short distance away, still partially in a car seat. The items found at the scene included a diaper bag and baby blanket that matched those Joanne had taken with her the day she disappeared. Dental records and DNA confirmed what investigators feared. The bodies were Joanne Katranak and her infant son, Alex. The autopsy results indicated Joanne had been struck multiple times in the head. leading to her death. Alex, though found with no signs of trauma, had likely died from exposure or lack of care shortly after Joanne's murder. The discovery ended months of uncertainty and cast a pall of grief over the region. What had begun as a missing persons case was now officially classified as a double homicide. The remote location, dense with underbrush and difficult to access, suggested an intentional effort to conceal the bodies. Investigators believed they had been left there since shortly after the day they disappeared. The forensic team collected hair, fibers, and soil samples. In particular, several long, light-colored hairs were recovered from the bindings around Joanne's body. These would later become central to the investigation. The nature of the bindings and the position of the bodies pointed to a deliberate, controlled crime, committed with time and intent. It also suggested that the killer had some familiarity with the area or had specifically chosen it to avoid detection. The press conference announcing the discovery was somber. Andrew Katranak, visibly shaken, made no immediate statement. Joanne's family, devastated, began making funeral arrangements. The community, which had held out hope for a safe return, now turned its attention to finding the person responsible. Police doubled their efforts, now treating the case as a homicide investigation. They revisited all earlier interviews and re-examined the physical evidence. The presence of foreign hairs was seen as a promising lead. Forensic scientists began the slow process of DNA analysis. With no eyewitnesses and no clear motive, the case depended heavily on what science could uncover from the scene. Attention narrowed on individuals with both motive and opportunity. Among them, Patricia Rohrer stood out. Her prior relationship with Andrew and reports of her attempts to contact him months before the murders had already raised suspicions. Investigators now sought to determine if her connection to the case extended beyond past history and into the forensic evidence left behind in that wooded stretch of Heidelberg Township. The breakthrough in the investigation came from a microscopic level within the strands of hair and fibers collected from the crime scene. After confirming Joanne and Alex's identities, forensic analysts turned their focus to the physical evidence recovered from the bindings and the baby's seat. Among the most significant were long blonde hairs found entangled in the rope used to bind Joanne. These hairs did not match Joanne, Alex, or anyone known to frequent the household. Authorities revisited earlier interviews and re-examined the timeline leading up to the disappearance. One person resurfaced repeatedly: Patricia Rohrer, Andrew Katranak's ex-girlfriend, who now lived in North Carolina. She had previously been dismissed due to lack of evidence and distance. But new technological developments gave investigators a path forward. Mitochondrial DNA testing, still a developing tool at the time, allowed analysts to compare the hair's genetic material to potential suspects. Patricia Rohrer had long blonde hair, and her previous calls to Andrew's home in the months before Joanne's disappearance rekindled interest in her. Investigators obtained a DNA sample from her and compared it to the mitochondrial DNA extracted from the hairs. The match was not specific to Patricia alone. It could be shared with maternal relatives, but it significantly narrowed the suspect pool. Additionally, phone records showed calls made from Rohrer's residence in North Carolina on December 14th and then again on December 16th. This gap intrigued investigators. It was theoretically possible she had traveled to Pennsylvania and returned within that time frame. A review of her activities during that period uncovered inconsistencies. Rohrer had claimed to be working at a horse stable in North Carolina on the day Joanne disappeared, but co-workers provided conflicting accounts of her presence. Further inquiries uncovered that a long drive from North Carolina to Pennsylvania and back, about 16 hours round trip, was logistically possible. Surveillance and fuel receipt evidence was limited or unavailable, but the absence of clear proof placing her in North Carolina at the crucial time created more questions. The hair evidence was bolstered by the discovery of other fibers consistent with Rohrer's environment, including traces of dog hair matching the breed owned by her. This accumulation of forensic and circumstantial data began to form a coherent narrative. Someone matching her profile had the opportunity, lacked a confirmed alibi, and left behind forensic traces at the crime scene. Detectives theorized a motive rooted in resentment and unresolved feelings over the breakup with Andrew. Though no direct threats or confrontations had occurred recently, Rohrer had reportedly expressed lingering anger toward Andrew and Joanne in conversations with acquaintances. The investigators considered the possibility that she had driven to Catasauqua, lured Joanne from her home under a pretext, and forcibly removed both mother and child. After months of pursuing leads with minimal progress, law enforcement now had enough to act. A suspect emerged not only from theory, but from the tangible remnants left behind at a rural crime scene. For the first time, the case had direction. All attention turned to North Carolina, where the investigation would next take a decisive step. Patricia Rohrer was born and raised in North Carolina. In her early 20s, she met Andrew Katranak while living in Pennsylvania. The relationship was intense but ultimately short-lived. They dated for about a year before breaking up, and Andrew eventually met and married Joanne O'Connor. Rohrer returned to North Carolina, where she worked with horses and raised her daughter. Those who knew her described her as tough, independent, and sometimes temperamental. She had a reputation for being assertive and outspoken. In the years after her breakup with Andrew, Patricia reportedly remained aware of his life, including his marriage and the birth of his child. While there was no direct evidence of ongoing contact, she made several phone calls to Andrew's residence in the months before Joanne's disappearance. These calls later became a focal point in the investigation. Investigators believed they showed that Patricia had not fully moved on and might have harbored resentment. At the time of the disappearance in December 1994, Rohrer was living in North Carolina and working in a horse stable. She shared a residence with her daughter and frequently visited her mother, who lived nearby. Her life appeared stable, and there were no known incidents suggesting violent behavior. Still, the calls to Andrew's home raised questions, and discrepancies in her alibi from that week triggered suspicion. When initially questioned in 1995, Rohrer cooperated with authorities. She denied any involvement and provided what she said was a work schedule for the days in question. However, some of her statements did not align with records or interviews with her co-workers. These inconsistencies, combined with the DNA evidence from the crime scene, placed her back in the spotlight 2 years later. Investigators dug deeper into her past and personality. Though she had no prior criminal record, interviews with former acquaintances painted a mixed picture. Some described her as hard-working and devoted to her child. Others recalled outbursts of anger and grudges that lingered. Still, nothing in her background suggested a capacity for the kind of violence witnessed in the Katranak case, until the forensic links emerged. Law enforcement began to reconstruct a hypothetical journey. Patricia Rohrer driving from North Carolina to Catasauqua, arriving on December 15, 1994. She could have approached Joanne's home during the day, lured her outside under some pretense, and forced her into Joanne's own car with the baby. From there, the theory went, she could have driven to a secluded location and committed the crime, disposing of the bodies in the woods before returning to North Carolina. The tight timeline was difficult, but not impossible. By 1997, with improved forensic analysis and mounting circumstantial evidence, the image of Patricia Rohrer shifted from a former girlfriend to a prime suspect. The quiet stability of her life in North Carolina was soon to be upended by what investigators believed was a long-concealed act of revenge. On June 24, 1997, Patricia Rohrer was arrested at her home in North Carolina. The arrest came more than 2 years after the disappearance and murder of Joanne and Alex Katranak. It marked the culmination of a prolonged investigation that had relied heavily on forensic breakthroughs and persistent re-examination of the case. Officers arrived quietly, and Rohrer was taken into custody without incident. She appeared surprised but composed, maintaining her innocence from the outset. The warrant for her arrest was issued based on a combination of mitochondrial DNA evidence, phone records, timeline inconsistencies, and a pattern of behavior that law enforcement believed established motive and opportunity. Though no eyewitnesses or direct physical evidence such as fingerprints placed her at the scene, the hair recovered from the bindings and car seat was consistent with Rohrer's DNA profile. Combined with the circumstantial framework built around her movements and prior relationship with Andrew Katranak, authorities believed they had enough to charge her. Rohrer was extradited to Pennsylvania, where she was formally arraigned. The charges included 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and related offenses. The court denied bail. At her arraignment, Rohrer again professed her innocence. Her defense team quickly began building a case to challenge the reliability of the forensic evidence, particularly the DNA analysis used to tie her to the crime scene. The public reaction was swift and divided. Many were shocked that someone living quietly in another state could be accused of such a calculated act. Others, particularly those in the Lehigh Valley who had followed the case closely, felt a sense of resolution. For Joanne's family, the arrest brought a measure of relief, though the pain of their loss remained fresh. In the months that followed, the prosecution and defense prepared for what was expected to be a complex trial. The prosecution focused on the hair evidence, the timing of Rohrer's phone calls, and the absence of a verifiable alibi. They emphasized that no one else had emerged as a plausible suspect, and that the nature of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive. The defense sought to undermine the scientific methods used to identify Rohrer as the source of the hair. They argued that mitochondrial DNA could not uniquely identify an individual and suggested that contamination or misinterpretation might have influenced the results. They also pointed to the lack of direct physical evidence. No fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no surveillance, linking Rohrer to the abduction or the murder scene. Despite the pretrial debates, the central question loomed: could forensic evidence alone convict someone of a double homicide, even in the absence of a confession or direct witness testimony? The courtroom was set for a legal battle that would test the limits of forensic science in the justice system and determine whether Patricia Rohrer would be held accountable for the deaths of Joanne and Alex Katranak. The trial of Patricia Rohrer began in September 1998 in Lehigh County Court, drawing national attention. The prosecution presented a case built largely on forensic science, particularly the mitochondrial DNA analysis of hairs found at the crime scene. They argued these hairs, discovered on the bindings used to tie Joanne Katranak and in the baby's car seat, linked directly to Rohrer. Though mitochondrial DNA does not uniquely identify an individual, the prosecution maintained the odds of the hairs belonging to someone else were extremely low given the context. Prosecutors laid out a timeline. Rohrer, they contended, left her home in North Carolina and drove to Pennsylvania on December 15, 1994. They argued she confronted Joanne at her home, lured her into the car with Alex and drove them to a remote wooded area. There, they alleged, Rohrer beat Joanne to death and left Alex to die of exposure. The motive, they claimed, stemmed from jealousy and unresolved anger over Andrew Katranek's new life. The prosecution relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They presented phone records showing Rohrer's calls to the Katranek home in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. They highlighted inconsistencies in her alibi and pointed to statements she allegedly made about knowing details of the case that had not been publicly released. The defense challenged the credibility and reliability of the forensic evidence. They emphasized the limitations of mitochondrial DNA, noting it could not conclusively prove the hairs belonged to Rohrer. They questioned the chain of custody for the evidence and raised the possibility of contamination during collection or analysis. The defense also argued that Rohrer had no history of violence and no direct connection to the crime scene beyond the disputed forensic material. Witnesses were called from both sides. Forensic experts debated the interpretation of the DNA results. Rohrer's acquaintances testified to her demeanor and actions in December 1994. The prosecution highlighted her access to similar materials as those found at the scene. The defense underscored the absence of a motive strong enough to prompt such a brutal crime and the lack of eyewitnesses or physical evidence such as fingerprints or fibers in Joanne's home or vehicle. Rohrer did not testify. Her defense team maintained that the case was speculative and built on flawed science. But the prosecution argued that the hair, combined with motive and opportunity, formed a coherent and compelling picture of guilt. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Patricia Rohrer was convicted of the first-degree murders of Joanne and Alex Katranek, as well as kidnapping and related charges. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict marked the end of a years-long investigation and delivered a measure of closure to the Katranek family. For prosecutors, it was a validation of forensic science's role in modern investigations. For Rohrer and her supporters, it marked the beginning of a continuing fight to overturn what they believed was a wrongful conviction. Following her conviction in 1998, Patricia Rohrer was transferred to the State Correctional Institution at Muncie to serve her life sentence. From the outset, she maintained her innocence. As the years passed, her case continued to attract attention from legal advocates and journalists who questioned the reliability of the forensic evidence used to secure her conviction. The primary focus centered on the use of mitochondrial DNA, which, while more resilient than nuclear DNA, could not conclusively pinpoint an individual to the exclusion of all others. Rohrer's legal team began a series of appeals, arguing that her trial had relied on insufficient and potentially flawed scientific evidence. They challenged the admissibility of the hair evidence, suggesting possible contamination or procedural lapses during collection and analysis. Further, they claimed the defense had been denied full access to the FBI's testing methodology and records, which they argued could have influenced the outcome of the trial. In 2004, a major development came when additional forensic testing was conducted. This time, nuclear DNA tests were performed on items from the crime scene. According to the defense, some results did not match Rohrer, which they argued supported her innocence. However, these findings did not persuade the courts to overturn her conviction. The prosecution maintained that the key evidence, particularly the mitochondrial DNA results, remained valid and pointed strongly to Rohrer. Over the next several years, Rohrer filed multiple appeals in both state and federal court. She alleged ineffective assistance of counsel, suppression of potentially exculpatory evidence, and flawed forensic procedures. While some of her claims were granted hearings, none resulted in a reversal or retrial. The courts repeatedly upheld the conviction, emphasizing the totality of the evidence and the jury's findings. Her case also became a topic of discussion among forensic experts and legal scholars, many of whom cited it as an example of the complexities and limitations of forensic science in criminal trials. The debate highlighted how evolving technologies and standards could impact past convictions, particularly in cases built largely on circumstantial and scientific evidence. Meanwhile, advocacy groups took interest in Rohrer's case, and investigative journalists revisited the trial and forensic analysis. Some argued that key evidence had been overstated, or that alternative suspects had not been sufficiently explored. Despite this, official efforts to reopen the case were unsuccessful. Joanne and Alex Katrinak's family continued to support the original verdict. For them, the conviction brought accountability for a deeply personal and tragic loss. They remained steadfast in their belief that justice had been served and expressed frustration with continued efforts to challenge the outcome. By the late 2010s, Rohrer had exhausted most of her legal avenues. She remained incarcerated, still declaring her innocence, and continued to pursue any remaining legal or investigative options. The questions raised by her case persisted, feeding broader discussions about the role of forensic evidence in the justice system and the standards by which such evidence should be judged. As of 2025, Patricia Rohrer remains incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole for the murders of Joanne and Alex Katrinak. Over 2 decades have passed since the verdict, yet the case continues to generate public interest, with debates centered around forensic integrity, wrongful conviction claims, and the evolution of legal standards. Rohrer's legal team and supporters have persisted in their efforts to reopen the case. A central argument remains the contested validity of the mitochondrial DNA evidence. While such testing was relatively new during the late 1990s, it has since become more standardized, with clearer guidelines about its limitations. Critics of the original investigation argue that the conclusions drawn from the hair evidence may have been overstated during trial proceedings, and that the chain of custody may not have met the rigorous standards now expected in forensic investigations. Further, some legal advocates have emphasized discrepancies in the timeline of events and lack of physical evidence directly placing Rohrer in Pennsylvania on the day of the murders. They point to the absence of her fingerprints in Joanne's vehicle or home, and note that the prosecution's theory depended heavily on inferences built around motive and opportunity rather than direct proof. In response, prosecutors have consistently defended the conviction. They argue that the totality of the evidence, Rohrer's prior relationship with Andrew Katrinak, her phone calls to his home, the hair findings, and her inconsistent alibi, formed a compelling and coherent narrative of guilt. The courts have repeatedly upheld the jury's decision, denying post-conviction relief based on the standards of evidence available at the time of trial. Public interest in the case has been renewed periodically through documentaries, crime podcasts, and television programs that examine the facts in legal proceedings. These often present differing views, with some emphasizing potential flaws in the prosecution's case, and others reinforcing the thoroughness of the original investigation. In parallel, the families affected by the case have remained vocal. Joanne Katrinak's relatives have expressed enduring grief and a firm belief that justice was done. For them, reopening the case is seen not as a pursuit of truth, but as a painful revisiting of trauma. Patricia Rohrer, now in her 50s, continues to assert her innocence from prison. She has participated in interviews and maintains communication with supporters who argue for her exoneration. Her case is sometimes cited in discussions around the need for more rigorous standards in forensic science and post-conviction review. Despite extensive legal efforts and media attention, no new trial has been granted. The legal system has consistently upheld the conviction, citing no new evidence substantial enough to alter the original outcome. As the years continue, the case of Joanne and Alex Katranak endures as a complex chapter in the intersection of forensic science, justice, and enduring controversy. Paige Bergfeld lived a dynamic, multifaceted life in Grand Junction, Colorado. Born in 1973, she was known for her vibrant personality and tenacity. A mother of 3, Paige was raising her children as a single parent following her second divorce. Friends described her as driven and caring, someone who balanced her responsibilities with ambition. By her early 30s, she had founded several small businesses, including a dance school for children and a home-based kitchenware sales venture. Behind the public image, however, Paige maintained a carefully concealed secret. In addition to her visible enterprises, she operated an escort service called Models Inc. under the alias Carrie. This business, conducted through a separate phone line and advertising in discreet online directories, remained hidden from most in her personal life. Her motivations, as later indicated through messages and financial records, stemmed in part from the need to support her family and maintain her household stability. Paige's days were packed, shuttling children to school and activities, managing home duties, and coordinating with clients. The dual existence required meticulous planning and a high degree of secrecy. Close friends later recalled her appearing exhausted but never complaining. She often wrote to-do lists, scheduled appointments with precision, and rarely took time for herself. Her relationships were also complex. Her second marriage to Rob Dixon ended in divorce, but left open channels of occasional communication. Prior to her disappearance, she had been in contact with both Dixon and her first ex-husband, Ron Beigler. Friends noted that Paige occasionally reconnected with former partners, sometimes for emotional closure, other times out of curiosity. In June 2007, she had been speaking with Beigler, who was visiting from out of state. Their interaction was friendly and included a picnic with her children, showing a desire to maintain cordial relations for the sake of the kids. Despite the facade of normalcy, some who were close to Paige sensed an underlying tension in her life, a burden she carried without sharing the full weight of it with anyone. By late June, Paige was juggling appointments, errands, and parenting responsibilities as usual. There was no outward indication that anything was amiss. Yet, as investigators would later piece together, her meticulously structured world was teetering on a dangerous edge, one that would come crashing down in the days ahead. On June 28, 2007, Paige Bergfeld went about her day as she normally would, attentive to her children, completing errands, and maintaining her many roles. That afternoon, she took her children on a picnic with her first ex-husband, Ron Beigler, who was visiting from out of state. The outing appeared pleasant and routine, a picture of blended familial harmony. By evening, Paige dropped her children off at her parents' house in Grand Junction, indicating she had errands to run and would return later. After leaving her parents' home, Paige made a series of phone calls from her cell phone. These calls, later crucial to investigators, traced her movements as she headed south, eventually into the area of Whitewater. At 9:51 p.m., her last known call was logged. From that moment, she ceased all communication. She never returned home, and her children spent the night with their grandparents, unaware of what had transpired. By the next morning, family members were concerned. Paige's absence was uncharacteristic. She was not someone who left her children without notice or contact. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Her voicemail box quickly filled. Family and friends reported her missing to authorities that same day. Local police began a preliminary search, canvassing the area near her last known location and reaching out to acquaintances for leads. 3 days later, on July 1st, 2007, a significant break occurred. A red Ford Focus registered to Paige was found engulfed in flames in a parking lot in Grand Junction. The vehicle, located near the intersection of 23 Road and H Road, was badly burned but still identifiable. It appeared to have been set on fire deliberately. Investigators recovered several personal items from within and around the car, but Paige was not found. News of the discovery spread quickly. The charred vehicle confirmed fears that something serious had happened. As officers processed the scene, they also began searching surrounding areas and collecting surveillance footage from nearby businesses. At the same time, Paige's personal life came under increasing scrutiny, especially as investigators reviewed her phone records and internet history. With her car recovered and no sign of her for days, the case moved from a missing person report to a suspected abduction. The disappearance of a devoted mother of 3, under mysterious and alarming circumstances, quickly drew public and media attention. Law enforcement widened their search radius and began interviewing dozens of individuals connected to Paige, determined to trace her final movements. As the search for Paige Bergfeld intensified, investigators turned their attention to her digital footprint and phone activity in the hours leading up to her disappearance. The results shifted the direction of the case. Among the records, authorities discovered frequent communication with a range of men, calls made under a separate contact identity. These findings unveiled a side of Paige's life that had remained hidden from her family and much of her social circle. Paige operated an escort business called Models Inc., using the alias Carrie. She advertised her services online through discreet adult websites and maintained a separate phone line exclusively for the enterprise. This side business had been running parallel to her public image as a homemaker and entrepreneur. Financial records indicated it was a significant source of income, often helping her manage expenses for her home and children. The revelation stunned those close to her. Friends and family, previously unaware of this aspect of her life, struggled to reconcile the devoted mother they knew with the person detailed in these records. For law enforcement, the information shifted the investigative framework. The possibility that her disappearance was connected to her work as an escort became central to the case. Detectives began identifying and interviewing men who had contacted Carrie through the Models Inc.'s number. Some admitted to hiring her, others denied involvement. Paige's meticulous record-keeping proved useful. Logs of client appointments, contact details, and notes about interactions were retrieved from her home. These records expanded the list of potential suspects and highlighted the inherent risk in the secret profession she had chosen. Beyond the phone and appointment logs, authorities also examined the content of Paige's personal computer. Emails and browser history provided insight into the structure and frequency of her escort work. One message thread suggested she had planned to meet a client on the night of her disappearance. The content was vague, but the timing aligned with her final known whereabouts. This line of investigation produced dozens of leads. Investigators were methodical, narrowing the scope by focusing on individuals with prior criminal histories, inconsistencies in their statements, or contact with her close to the time she went missing. Despite the volume of data, no single individual stood out, yet. Meanwhile, the community reaction to the dual life story was mixed. sympathy for her as a victim remained, but public opinion also focused on the risks associated with her secret work. Law enforcement emphasized the importance of maintaining focus on finding her and identifying whoever was responsible, regardless of how she earned her income. As this new dimension of the case came into full view, it brought with it both progress and complexity. The public image of a missing mother had now expanded to include an entire second identity, raising questions about trust, vulnerability, and the unknown dangers she may have faced in the hours before she vanished. With Paige Bergfeld's double life now exposed, investigators began tracing the fragmented evidence she left behind. One of the most significant breakthroughs occurred in early July 2007, when a series of personal items began appearing along a stretch of Highway 50 near the small town of Whitewater. Over several days, search teams recovered Paige's belongings: checks, a business ledger, a shoe, a purse, and even her cosmetic items, scattered intermittently across a 5-mile radius. The nature of the finds indicated the items may have been discarded from a moving vehicle, suggesting an attempt to either destroy evidence or divert the investigation. These discoveries confirmed that Paige had traveled south from Grand Junction the night she disappeared, aligning with cell tower data, showing her phone pinging in that direction. Among the items was a burned planner, partially legible, which included appointments and names later cross-referenced with her phone records. This detail added further validation to her carefully organized schedule and substantiated her connection with various clients, some of whom she had contacted shortly before vanishing. Investigators pored over Paige's phone activity, analyzing dozens of calls made on June 28th. A notable call had been made to a disposable phone number associated with a man named Lester Ralph Jones. His name had surfaced previously. He had been a customer of Models Inc., and records showed he had contacted Paige multiple times in the days preceding her disappearance. Detectives learned that Jones worked at an RV dealership located just across the highway from where Paige's car was found burned. His proximity to key locations, coupled with his communications with Paige, raised immediate suspicions. Furthermore, surveillance footage from a nearby business captured a man resembling Jones leaving the RV lot on the evening of June 28th, a detail that placed him in the right place at a critical time. When questioned, Jones admitted to contacting Paige but denied ever meeting her in person. He claimed to have called her escort number, but said he never followed through with an appointment. His statement was considered inconsistent with other data, including his previous history of domestic violence and his possession of multiple cell phones. The presence of a burned vehicle near his place of employment only deepened law enforcement's interest. Despite these leads, the case remained circumstantial. There was no physical evidence linking Jones, or anyone else, to Paige's disappearance. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. The items found along Highway 50 were carefully collected and logged, but they did not provide definitive proof of foul play or identify the perpetrator. Nonetheless, investigators kept narrowing their focus. With a short list of suspects, all of whom had some connection to her escort services, they began cross-referencing alibis, travel logs, and cell tower data. Jones remained a focal point, not yet charged, but increasingly under surveillance and scrutiny. The trail, though fragmented, was beginning to form a coherent picture. It was a puzzle of burnt paper, digital footprints, and roadside debris, a constellation of evidence pointing towards something darker and more deliberate. As the investigation progressed, Lester Ralph Jones became more than just a name in phone records. Born in Colorado and with a lengthy criminal history, Jones had previous convictions for kidnapping and assault. He was known to law enforcement and had served time in prison. His violent past, combined with recent communications with Paige Bergfeld, elevated him to the status of prime suspect. Jones worked as a mechanic at an RV dealership in Grand Junction, located directly across from the lot where Paige's burned car had been found. This geographical link made investigators take a closer look at his movements on the evening of June 28th. Security footage showed a man resembling Jones leaving the dealership around the same time Paige's phone had gone dark. He left shortly before closing hours and was gone for over an hour, long enough, detectives believed, to commit a crime and dispose of evidence. Phone records confirmed that Jones had called Paige's escort number from a burner phone in the days leading up to her disappearance. Investigators also discovered that he had purchased the disposable phone just days prior, and that it had been used exclusively to contact her. When confronted about this, Jones admitted to making the calls, but denied any in-person meeting. He claimed he never went through with the appointment. Investigators found Jones's explanation inconsistent. They noted the effort he went through to obscure his identity, using a burner phone, making calls during specific hours, and erasing recent call logs. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses added more suspicion. Though grainy, the footage showed a person matching his build, walking near the location where Paige's car was later found burning. Further analysis showed Jones had clocked out of work unusually early that night. He was unaccounted for during a critical window in the timeline of Paige's disappearance. When asked to explain his whereabouts, he gave vague responses, citing errands and personal time. No one could corroborate his statements. Police obtained a search warrant for Jones's home, vehicle, and workplace. Several items were seized, including cell phones, computers, and personal effects. However, the search yielded no direct forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The lack of DNA, blood, or other physical traces meant that while the circumstantial case was growing stronger, a criminal charge would require more definitive proof. Throughout the fall of 2007, Jones remained under close observation. He was aware of the scrutiny and began changing routines, switching phones, varying his commute, and avoiding interviews. Despite his evasiveness, he was never arrested or formally charged during this period. Detectives compiled a case file that outlined the growing body of indirect evidence: the calls to Paige, his criminal background, the proximity of his workplace, the unexplained absence, and the surveillance footage. Although circumstantial, the consistency of these elements pointed increasingly toward his involvement. Still, without a body or physical evidence, prosecutors hesitated. Jones remained a person of interest, but no warrant was issued. The investigation, though persistent, reached a frustrating standstill. For Paige's family and investigators, the truth hovered just beyond reach, anchored by suspicion, but starved of final proof. Months turned into years, and Paige Bergfeld remained missing. Despite the initial flurry of investigative activity and the identification of Lester Jones as a person of interest, no arrest was made. The absence of her body severely hindered efforts to move forward with a prosecution. Investigators lacked the conclusive evidence needed to formally charge anyone, even as suspicion around Jones persisted. Paige's disappearance weighed heavily on her family, especially her children. Raised by their grandparents, they grew up surrounded by reminders of their mother's unresolved fate. Her parents continued to advocate for the case, working closely with law enforcement, participating in public awareness efforts, and refusing to let the case go cold. Every item found along Highway 50 was preserved, every lead followed, but the critical piece, her remains, remained elusive. During this period, law enforcement maintained intermittent surveillance on Jones. They re-examined the evidence, reviewed timelines, and revisited interviews. New forensic techniques were considered, but the material evidence was limited and degraded. Each reanalysis yielded the same conclusion. While Lester Jones remained the most viable suspect, the case needed a breakthrough. The passage of time also brought complications. Memories faded, witnesses relocated, and legal standards remained unchanged. The district attorney's office, while sympathetic, required more than inference. The absence of physical evidence, particularly without a body, left too much room for reasonable doubt. Page's parents, though devastated, never stopped searching. With the help of volunteers and local agencies, they organized periodic searches in rural areas of Mesa and Delta counties, places theorized to be potential dump sites. These efforts involved horseback teams, drones, and cadaver dogs, but no human remains were found. The media occasionally revisited the case, reminding the public of the unresolved disappearance of a mother and entrepreneur who had led a complex life. Each article renewed public interest and sometimes brought in new tips, but none proved substantial. The image of Page, a smiling woman with auburn hair, a business portfolio, and 3 young children, remained in the collective memory of the community. By the 5th anniversary of her disappearance, the tone of public and private conversations had shifted. There was a growing acceptance that Page was no longer alive. What remained uncertain was who was responsible and whether justice would ever be served. For investigators, the case was still open, but progress had slowed to a near halt. The waiting continued. Evidence sat preserved in boxes, timelines mapped on charts, and names still circled in red ink. All leads pointed in one direction, but the case lacked the final, undeniable link. It would take a discovery, unexpected and long overdue, to shake the case back to life. On March 6, 2012, nearly 5 years after Paige Bergfeld disappeared, 2 hikers exploring Wells Gulch in Delta County stumbled upon what appeared to be human remains. The area, a rugged and remote part of western Colorado, was difficult to access and seldom traversed. Among the skeletal remains were personal items, including clothing and accessories that appeared to match the descriptions given by Page's family at the time of her disappearance. Law enforcement responded immediately. The site was secured and forensics teams were brought in to conduct a thorough recovery operation. Over several days, investigators collected the remains and surrounding evidence. Due to the length of time the body had been exposed to the elements, identification required forensic analysis. Dental records were used to confirm what many had already feared. Paige Bergfeld had been found. The discovery reignited the case. Her remains had been located in a dry wash, miles from where her vehicle had been found. The location was remote, consistent with a deliberate attempt to conceal a body. For the first time, authorities had physical evidence to work with. Bones were analyzed for trauma, and soil samples were taken to identify any possible trace materials. The confirmation of her death removed the uncertainty that had haunted her family and investigators for nearly half a decade. It transformed the missing person case into a homicide investigation. Detectives re-examined every piece of evidence through a new lens, now able to correlate their earlier findings with a verified crime scene. The location of the remains also brought renewed focus to Lester Jones. Wells Gulch was approximately 35 miles from Grand Junction, in a direction that aligned with previous cell phone pings associated with Jones's movements. Furthermore, the discovery provided an opportunity to reframe the case with the inclusion of death, motive, and disposal methodology. Forensic experts worked to determine cause of death, though the condition of the remains made it difficult to identify specific injuries. Still, the location and the circumstances supported law enforcement's theory that Paige had been murdered and her body deliberately hidden. Public reaction was swift and emotional. The community, long aware of the case, mourned the official confirmation of her death. Media coverage expanded nationally again, revisiting her story and the unresolved questions around her final hours. With new evidence in hand, investigators redoubled efforts to prepare a prosecutable case. All previous interviews, phone logs, and surveillance footage were reviewed again. Prosecutors worked closely with detectives to evaluate the cumulative weight of the evidence. Paige's discovery had removed the most significant obstacle to filing charges. In the months that followed, the case against Lester Jones was formally assembled, though direct physical evidence linking him to the scene remained limited. The circumstantial case, now bolstered by the discovery of Paige's body, grew stronger. The decision to pursue prosecution was no longer a question of if, but when. Following the discovery of Paige Bergfeld's remains in 2012, the Mesa County Sheriff's Office intensified its efforts to compile a comprehensive case against Lester Ralph Jones. The 5-year investigation had already amassed a significant volume of circumstantial evidence. Now, with Paige officially confirmed deceased, prosecutors could present a clearer narrative of abduction and homicide. Jones remained the central suspect. Investigators revisited his past interactions with Paige, his criminal history, and the unexplained gaps in his timeline on the evening of June 28, 2007. The fact that he had used a prepaid phone to contact her, and that the same phone went inactive shortly after her disappearance, remained a key component of the timeline. The phone, registered under a false identity, had been used exclusively to communicate with Paige. Additionally, GPS and cell tower data, though limited, showed Jones's phone traveling south of Grand Junction, near where Paige's belongings had been scattered along Highway 50. This movement pattern was consistent with someone attempting to dispose of evidence. The discovery of her body in Wells Gulch further reinforced the theory, placing the likely route within a geographical zone accessible from his home and work. Prosecutors also scrutinized Jones's behavior. He had failed to provide a consistent alibi for the night Paige vanished. His accounts changed across multiple interviews. Moreover, he had reportedly expressed hostility toward women in past relationships, and a pattern of controlling behavior emerged from prior domestic abuse cases. Investigators mapped the circumstantial evidence: a history of violence, a link to the escort service, proximity to where the car was found, burner phone activity, lack of alibi, and behavioral patterns. While no single item was definitive, together they formed a prosecutable case. Prosecutors prepared to argue that the combination of opportunity, motive, and deception pointed clearly to Jones. In November 2014, authorities arrested Lester Jones and charged him with murder, kidnapping, and arson. The indictment was based on the theory that he had lured Paige under the guise of a client meeting and killed her soon afterward. The burned vehicle and remote burial site were presented as part of a calculated effort to conceal the crime. Public and media reaction to the arrest was immediate. The case, dormant in the public eye for years, returned to headlines. Paige's family expressed relief that charges had finally been filed. After years of silence, they would now see the man they believed responsible face trial. The prosecution anticipated a difficult path ahead. No DNA, no eyewitnesses, and no confession meant they would rely entirely on the cohesion of circumstantial elements. The legal team prepared a timeline-driven presentation, combining digital records, surveillance, and testimonial inconsistencies. For the first time since her disappearance, the possibility of justice seemed tangible. The burden of proof would rest on their ability to connect each thread. each inconsistency and each deliberate act to one man, Lester Ralph Jones. In September 2016, more than 9 years after Paige Bergfeld vanished, Lester Ralph Jones stood trial for her murder. The case was tried in Mesa County District Court, drawing significant local and national media attention. For prosecutors, the challenge was clear. Present a narrative so cohesive and compelling that it would overcome the absence of direct forensic evidence. The prosecution's strategy hinged on timing, motive, and opportunity. They began with a detailed chronology of events on June 28, 2007. Paige's last known communications, the discovery of her car, the trail of personal items, and the eventual recovery of her remains were laid out in sequence. Phone records placed Jones in communication with Paige shortly before her disappearance, and video evidence showed him leaving work at a critical moment, never to return for hours. The jury heard from more than 60 witnesses over the course of the trial, including law enforcement officials, forensic experts, and Paige's acquaintances. A key focus was Jones's behavior. Witnesses testified about his violent past, including his abusive behavior in previous relationships. Prosecutors argued that his pattern of control and aggression supported the theory that he could have acted violently against Paige. Surveillance footage from a business near the RV dealership where Jones worked was shown to the jury. It depicted a figure walking near the lot around the time Paige's car was believed to have been set on fire. Though the footage lacked clarity, prosecutors used it to illustrate Jones's proximity to key locations. The defense countered by pointing out the lack of physical evidence tying Jones directly to the crime. They emphasized that no DNA, fingerprints, or biological traces from Paige had been found in Jones's home, car, or workplace. They argued that the state had built a case around suspicion rather than proof. The defense also questioned the reliability of cell tower data and challenged the conclusiveness of the surveillance images. Throughout the proceedings, Paige's family attended daily. Their presence underscored the emotional weight of the trial, though the judge instructed the jury to focus solely on the facts. After several weeks of testimony and cross-examination, the case was handed to the jury. Deliberations began with high tension. Jurors reviewed hours of testimony and re-examined key exhibits. After days of discussion, the jury announced it was deadlocked. Despite the weight of the circumstantial evidence, they could not reach a unanimous verdict. The judge declared a mistrial. For Paige's family, the mistrial was a crushing setback. Years of investigation and preparation had brought them to the brink of resolution, only for the case to stall once again. Still, the prosecution announced they would retry the case. They believed the evidence was strong enough and that a new jury might see the case differently. Preparations for a second trial began immediately. Witnesses were re-interviewed, arguments refined, and strategies adjusted. The prosecution remained confident. The delay was painful, but the pursuit of justice was not over. Just weeks after the mistrial, the state of Colorado retried Lester Ralph Jones for the murder of Paige Bergfeld. In November 2016, a new jury was impaneled in Mesa County. With minimal delay between proceedings, the prosecution refined its case while maintaining its core argument that Jones had premeditatedly lured Paige under false pretenses and killed her. The second trial followed much of the same evidentiary path as the first. Prosecutors presented the same chronological framework: Paige's last day, the suspicious phone calls, the discovery of her car and belongings, and ultimately the location of her remains. They emphasized the burner phone, bought by Jones and used only to contact Paige, which had gone silent on the same night she disappeared. They argued this deliberate concealment illustrated both planning and guilt. Additional emphasis was placed on motive and Jones's behavior. Witnesses again testified about his prior incidents of domestic violence. A former partner recounted a pattern of possessiveness and verbal threats. The prosecution highlighted that Jones, aware of Page's escort business, used that knowledge to orchestrate a meeting under a fake identity, intending harm. Jones's defense once more challenged the lack of physical evidence. They maintained that while Jones may have contacted Page, there was no proof he ever met her. They argued that suspicion did not equate to guilt, and criticized the state for failing to present a direct link. No DNA, no fingerprints, no weapon, and no witness to the alleged crime. This time, however, the cumulative weight of the circumstantial evidence resonated more deeply with the jury. The prosecution carefully reconstructed Jones's movements using surveillance footage and employment records, contrasting them against Page's disappearance window. The inconsistency of his alibi and the unexplained activity during the critical hours played a central role. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On November 18, 2016, they returned with a verdict: guilty on all counts. Jones was convicted of first-degree murder and second-degree kidnapping. Under Colorado law, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read. Page's family, seated together, held each other as the words sank in. For them, justice had been delayed, but not denied. After 9 years of uncertainty, they had a resolution. In sentencing, the judge spoke directly to the severity of the crime, the deception, the violence, and the effort to erase Page's existence. Jones offered no statement. He was remanded to the Colorado Department of Corrections to serve his life sentence. The conviction closed a long and painful chapter for those who knew and loved Paige Bergfeld. Though her life had ended tragically, the final outcome affirmed that her story had not been forgotten. Her family continued to honor her memory, not through the lens of how she died, but in how she lived, a determined mother, businesswoman, and friend who fought to provide for her children. Watkins, Minnesota, sits quietly in Meeker County, a town of fewer than 1,000 residents where neighbors know each other by name. Tucked into the state's central region, its rhythm is measured by local school events, Friday night games, and summer town festivals. It was here, in this modest, tight-knit setting, that the Ertl family built their life. Matt and Caitlin Ertl lived on the edge of town, raising their 3 children in a home surrounded by wide lawns and shaded trees. Their youngest, Elena Jeanne Ertl, had just turned 5. Known for her curly blonde hair, bright eyes, and cheerful demeanor, Elena attended preschool and often accompanied her parents and older siblings to local events. She enjoyed riding her bike and was especially fond of helping her mom in the kitchen, her laughter echoing in the family home. The Ertls were deeply involved in the community. Matt played amateur baseball and was a familiar figure on the local team, often bringing his family along to games. After the matches, it wasn't uncommon for teammates and friends to gather for a casual night at someone's house. These gatherings reflected the warmth and trust shared among neighbors in Watkins. Among the family's friends was Zachary Todd Anderson, 25, from nearby Coon Rapids. He had met Matt through baseball, and over time had been welcomed into the Ertls' home on several occasions. His presence was familiar, and he was considered trustworthy by the family. In the summer of 2016, life for the Ertls was predictable in its simplicity. Elena had just enjoyed her last summer before entering kindergarten. On August 19th, the family attended one of Matt's games. That evening, as they often did, they invited friends over, including Anderson. There was no indication then that anything was amiss. The night unfolded like many before it: food, conversation, children playing, and adults winding down after the game. As the Erdl family went to sleep that night, there was no sign that their lives were about to be upended. In a town where trust ran deep and danger seemed far away, no one could have imagined what the next morning would bring. August 19th, 2016 was a typical Friday evening in Watkins. The late summer air was warm, and the Erdl family had spent the day preparing for one of Matt's amateur baseball games. As usual, the game brought together local families and friends, providing an opportunity for the community to connect. That night, after the game, Matt invited several friends over to the house. Among them was Zachary Anderson, who had frequently stayed at the Erdl's home before. He had become a familiar face not only to Matt, but to Caitlin and their children, including Elena. The family's open-door policy and community spirit extended naturally to Anderson, who was treated like a guest and, by all accounts, acted as such. The household was busy that evening, with 3 children to manage and guests in the home. The Erdl's attention was split among various tasks. As the night progressed, the adults relaxed, talking and watching television, while the children eventually settled into their nightly routines. Elena, full of energy earlier in the day, was tucked into bed after spending time around the adults, as she often did during such gatherings. Anderson stayed the night. He had done so in the past without issue. Nothing in his behavior raised any red flags. He appeared calm and sociable. When the evening wound down, Matt and Caitlin went to bed, trusting that their home was secure and that the children were safe under their roof. During the night, nothing overtly alarming occurred to disturb the family. The household appeared calm into the early morning hours, but unbeknownst to them, a tragic turn had already been set in motion. By the time the sun rose over the quiet streets of Watkins on August 20th, a sequence of events had already unfolded inside the Erdl home that no one yet realized. Elena was no longer in her bed. Neither was Zachary Anderson. The family's white 2002 GMC Sierra truck was missing from the driveway. The Erdls awoke to find their youngest child gone. The morning of August 20th, 2016 began with an ordinary stillness. But that calm shattered quickly when Matt and Caitlin Erdl discovered their youngest daughter, Elena, was not in her bed. It was just after 8 a.m. when they noticed her absence. They searched the house, calling her name, moving from room to room, from the main floor to the basement, then outside. She was nowhere to be found. Compounding their panic was the realization that their truck, a white GMC Sierra, was also missing. So was Zachary Anderson. Until that moment, there had been no cause for concern. Anderson had been welcomed in the night before, but now the connection between his absence and Elena's missing presence drew immediate, chilling attention. Caitlin made the 911 call to report the disappearance. In her voice was urgency and disbelief. She described Elena's age, appearance, and last known clothing. She also mentioned that Anderson was missing and had likely taken their vehicle. The Meeker County Sheriff's Office responded rapidly. Given the circumstances and the involvement of a known adult last seen with the child, the case escalated quickly. An Amber Alert was issued around 10:30 a.m., nearly 2.5 hours after the family discovered Elena was gone. It included details about the child, the suspect, and the missing truck. The alert was broadcast across Minnesota and surrounding regions, prompting widespread public attention. Authorities treated the situation as a suspected abduction. The fact that Anderson had no custodial relationship to Elena and had left with the family's vehicle without permission contributed to the urgency. Investigators started tracing Anderson's digital footprint, and looked for any possible destinations. As hours passed, law enforcement agencies across the state coordinated their efforts. Meanwhile, the Erdl family remained at home, waiting, hoping, fearing. Friends and neighbors came by to offer support. Many joined the effort by sharing the Amber Alert online and spreading awareness in their communities. Though the small town of Watkins had seen emergencies before, this was different. A 5-year-old girl, taken in the night by someone the family had trusted, was missing. There were no signs of forced entry or disturbance, only silence, and the gnawing question of what had happened during the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. By late morning on August 20th, 2016, the state of Minnesota was fully engaged in the search for Elena Erdl. The Amber Alert described her as a 5-year-old white female with blonde hair, about 3 feet tall, last seen wearing a white nightgown. The suspect, Zachary Anderson, was identified as a 25-year-old white male, and the vehicle was a white 2002 GMC Sierra pickup with a Minnesota license plate. Law enforcement officials initiated a coordinated, multi-agency effort. The Meeker County Sheriff's Office worked with the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, FBI, and other agencies to trace Anderson's movements. The alert reached mobile devices, highway billboards, news stations, and online platforms, prompting citizens across the state to remain vigilant. Investigators began mapping possible routes Anderson might have taken. They looked into his background, connections, and known associates. It became clear early in the investigation that Anderson had access to a family-owned property, a cabin in Cass County, located over 100 miles north of Watkins. Digital data, including pings from the stolen truck's OnStar system and cell phone signals, helped authorities trace the vehicle's movement toward the area near Motley, Minnesota. This remote, wooded region was known to be less populated, with miles of forest, lakes, and unpaved roads. The Erdl family's stolen truck was soon located, parked near the cabin. It was unoccupied, but the proximity to Anderson's known family retreat suggested a likely destination. Local deputies were dispatched to the scene. The search was cautious. The property, surrounded by woods and water, posed risks, especially given the unknowns. Whether Anderson was armed, whether Elena was with him, and what his intentions might be. Helicopters, K-9 units, and officers on foot began sweeping the area. Roads leading in and out were monitored. Law enforcement teams moved systematically, working with limited information but a shared goal: to find Elena as quickly as possible. As the day progressed, the community in Watkins remained on edge. The news updates were frequent but thin on detail. The Erdl family waited, surrounded by support, yet alone in their fear. A picture of Elena, beaming with a soft smile, circulated widely. Her age and innocence were stark reminders of the urgency of the case. The Amber Alert, issued only hours before, had mobilized an entire state. But as daylight began to fade on August 20th, investigators knew that the window to find her safely was narrowing. By the afternoon of August 20th, 2016, law enforcement had confirmed the location of the Erdl family's missing white GMC Sierra. The truck was found parked near a remote cabin in Cass County, close to the town of Motley. The property, owned by Zachary Anderson's family, sat amid dense woods, swamps, and rugged terrain. Officers immediately secured the area and began a methodical search. The surroundings presented both logistical and tactical challenges. The terrain was thick with brush and scattered with outbuildings. Cell coverage was unreliable, and the narrow dirt roads made access slow. Authorities established a perimeter and deployed search teams into the woods. Drones and helicopters were brought in to survey from above. while officers on the ground moved carefully through the forested areas. As they searched the vicinity of the cabin, law enforcement discovered signs that someone had recently been there. Clothing, bedding, and discarded food packaging suggested brief occupation. But there was no sign of Elena. A short distance from the cabin, officers found Anderson walking along a trail. He was alone and unarmed. Deputies detained him without incident. When questioned on the spot, he reportedly provided vague answers, admitting only that he had been in the area but offering no clarity about Elena's whereabouts. His clothing was dirty and damp, consistent with having moved through the wet terrain. With Anderson in custody, the urgency shifted fully to locating Elena. Investigators pressed him for details, but he initially gave little useful information. Search teams refocused their efforts on the woods and surrounding wetlands, believing Elena could still be nearby. Several hundred yards from the cabin, in a wooded swamp, officers made a grim discovery. In a shallow area of water, concealed under debris, they found the body of Elena Erdl. She had been hidden intentionally. The location was remote and difficult to access on foot. Recovery personnel worked carefully to preserve the scene for forensic examination. The discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears. The Amber Alert was canceled. The criminal investigation entered a new phase, transitioning from search and recovery to gathering evidence for prosecution. Officers secured the scene and began collecting physical evidence, including soil samples, biological material, and any trace indicators of movement between the cabin and the swamp. Back in Watkins, the news spread rapidly. The small town that had rallied behind the Erdl family now faced the devastation of confirmation. Community members lit candles and left flowers in front of the Erdl residence. At the ball field where Matt had played just a day earlier, families gathered in silence. Elena's body was transported to the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's office for autopsy. Zachary Anderson was taken into custody, held without bail, and transferred to face formal charges. For investigators, there was still work to do, reconstructing the timeline, identifying what had happened during those missing hours, and preparing the case for court. Zachary Anderson was arrested on the afternoon of August 20th, 2016, in Cass County. Officers took him into custody near the cabin, walking alone along a wooded trail. He did not resist. When questioned at the scene, his answers were limited, and he offered no immediate explanation for his presence in the area or for Elena Erdl's disappearance. Authorities quickly secured him in a patrol vehicle and readied him for transport. As the search team intensified efforts around the cabin, officers scoured the area Anderson had likely accessed. They examined the shoreline of nearby wetlands, narrow paths into the woods, and the brush around the property. It was during this careful inspection that they discovered the body of Elena Erdl. She had been submerged in a swampy section of the forest, partially hidden beneath natural debris. The recovery operation was delicate. The terrain made it difficult to navigate, and investigators had to preserve the area for forensic evidence. Crime scene technicians documented the surroundings, photographing each segment of the approach and carefully collecting materials that might establish a clearer sequence of events. Law enforcement confirmed Elena's identity at the scene. Back at the sheriff's office, Anderson underwent initial interviews. He admitted to taking Elena from the Erdl home during the early morning hours. According to statements later used in court, he acknowledged that she was alive when he left with her. Investigators pressed for specifics, trying to understand the motives, the timeline, and the extent of premeditation, but much of Anderson's early testimony was fragmented. Authorities soon obtained search warrants for Anderson's phone and digital records. Texts, location data, and online activity became critical to establishing intent and movement. Physical evidence from the cabin and the site where Elena was found was sent to forensic labs for processing. Samples were tested for DNA, fingerprints, and other trace elements. Following his arrest, Anderson was booked into Cass County Jail. Given the nature of the case and the potential for public reaction, authorities implemented special security measures. He was held on suspicion of murder and kidnapping, with formal charges pending autopsy results and additional investigative steps. News of the arrest and the discovery of Elena's body reverberated across Minnesota. The Amber Alert had kept the public engaged for hours, and now the tragic outcome drew widespread grief. Memorials began to appear in Watkins. A growing number of residents gathered near the Erdl home and local church. Messages of condolence poured in from across the state. For investigators, the arrest marked only the beginning of a broader legal process. Their focus turned to building a case that would stand in court, a case centered on the short life of a 5-year-old girl and the betrayal of a trusted family friend. Following the recovery of Elena Erdl's body, the Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office conducted a full autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. The examination confirmed that Elena had suffered multiple forms of trauma. The autopsy findings indicated that she had been sexually assaulted and had died by strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. These results transformed the investigation from a general homicide case into one involving aggravated criminal sexual conduct and premeditated murder. The physical evidence collected from the scene, including biological samples, matched Zachary Anderson. The details outlined in the medical examiner's report were crucial in guiding the direction of the prosecution and the scope of the charges to be filed. Prosecutors moved swiftly. On August 22, 2016, Anderson was formally charged in Cass County District Court with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. The charging documents described how Anderson had taken Elena from her home while the rest of the family was asleep and transported her more than 100 miles north to the remote cabin. There, prosecutors alleged he committed sexual assault and then killed her. The complaint also referenced statements made by Anderson during his initial interviews, in which he admitted to taking the girl and acknowledged that she had been alive at the time. Further digital evidence, including data from his phone and other electronic devices, supported the timeline and location information already gathered by investigators. Anderson appeared in court for a preliminary hearing where he was denied bail. The courtroom was packed with law enforcement officers, media, and community members. His appearance was brief and his demeanor quiet. A public defender was appointed to represent him. As details of the autopsy and charges became public, the broader emotional toll deepened. Watkins, already grieving, now had to confront the full scope of what had been done to a child they had known and loved. In statements released later, Elena's parents spoke of her bright personality, her curiosity, and the indescribable loss they faced. The case quickly drew statewide and national attention. Officials emphasized the severity of the crimes and the strength of the forensic evidence. Investigators continued to compile records and reports, while prosecutors prepared for a complex legal battle. In the weeks following the charges, pretrial motions began to shape the case's trajectory. Anderson remained in custody, and the prosecution sought life without the possibility of parole. Forensic reports, interviews, and digital evidence were submitted as part of discovery as both sides prepared for a possible trial. But the autopsy had already told the story of what had happened in the early hours of August 20th, a story that would become central to the courtroom proceedings ahead. In the months following his arrest, Zachary Anderson remained in custody at the Cass County Jail under a hold for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and criminal sexual conduct. The charges carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. With the evidence presented by the prosecution, autopsy results, DNA findings, location data, and Anderson's partial admissions, the legal proceedings began with a series of pretrial motions. The defense, appointed by the court, sought to challenge the admissibility of some statements made by Anderson after his arrest. They argued for exclusion of certain evidence on procedural grounds, including the conditions of his initial interviews and access to legal counsel. Prosecutors countered that Anderson had been properly advised of his rights and that the statements were made voluntarily. The court held hearings to determine the admissibility of evidence. Forensic experts provided sworn testimony regarding DNA results, digital tracking of Anderson's phone, and the timeline constructed from data collected on the day of the crime. Surveillance footage and GPS logs were introduced to support the state's reconstruction of Anderson's movements. Although the defense requested a change of venue, citing pretrial publicity and community bias, the court denied the motion. The judge ruled that voir dire, or jury selection, would be sufficient to ensure a fair trial. Throughout early 2017, the prosecution and defense continued negotiations, with the state indicating its intention to seek the maximum penalty under Minnesota law. As the trial date approached, Anderson's legal team faced a mounting body of evidence. The state's case was bolstered not only by physical evidence, but by Anderson's own admissions during early interviews. In August 2017, nearly a year after Elena Erdel's death, Anderson entered a guilty plea. In open court, he admitted to abducting Elena from her home, driving her to the Cass County cabin, sexually assaulting her, and killing her. The plea eliminated the need for a jury trial and spared the Erdel family the ordeal of reliving the details in a courtroom. The guilty plea was accepted by the court. Sentencing was scheduled shortly thereafter, with impact statements to be delivered by the family. Prosecutors noted that the nature of the crime, its premeditation, brutality, and targeting of a vulnerable child, warranted the maximum sentence available. The plea deal included no concessions. Anderson faced mandatory life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the Erdel family, it provided a resolution, though not closure. The legal proceedings had confirmed what they already knew, but also ensured that the man responsible would remain imprisoned for the rest of his life. As the legal process concluded, the focus for the community and the family began to shift, from prosecution to remembrance, and from courtrooms to memorials. On October 30th, 2017, Zachary Anderson returned to court for sentencing. The courtroom was filled with members of the Erdel family, law enforcement, and residents of Watkins who had followed the case from the beginning. The atmosphere was subdued, tense, and heavy with the weight of the proceedings. The court had already accepted Anderson's guilty plea. The day's hearing would formalize his punishment and allow the family to speak. Anderson, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, stood silently as the judge reviewed the case history. The charges against him were recited one by one: kidnapping, sexual assault, and the first-degree murder of 5-year-old Elena Erdel. The facts, as detailed in court documents, had not changed. Anderson had taken Elena from her home, driven her to a remote cabin, and ended her life. Before the sentence was pronounced, members of Elena's family addressed the court. They spoke of her bright spirit, her laughter, and the future she would never have. Her parents described the trauma of discovering her missing and the days that followed. Their statements conveyed grief, anger, and a lasting sense of loss that could not be repaired by justice alone. The judge then sentenced Anderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was automatic under Minnesota law for first-degree murder involving aggravating factors, including kidnapping and sexual assault. There would be no appeals, no parole hearings, no future release. Following the sentencing, Anderson was transferred to the Minnesota Correctional Facility in Oak Park Heights, a maximum security prison. There, he would serve the remainder of his life in custody. The case, though closed legally, left enduring scars. In Watkins, the community responded with solemn support for the Ortle family. Schools lowered their flags, and local teams observed moments of silence. Fundraisers and memorial events were held, not just to support the family financially, but to express collective mourning. At the field where Matt Ertl had played baseball, a permanent bench was installed in Elena's memory. The case also prompted broader conversations across Minnesota about child safety and the vetting of overnight guests. Though Anderson had no criminal record prior to the crime, his actions led many families to reconsider assumptions about safety, even in close-knit communities. Law enforcement officials who had worked the case described it as among the most difficult of their careers. The coordination across agencies, the emotional toll of the discovery, and the nature of the crime left lasting impressions on everyone involved. While the legal chapter of the case had ended, the impact of Elena's death remained deeply felt. Her story became a symbol not only of tragedy, but of how quickly trust can be shattered and how communities can come together in its aftermath. In the months after Elena Ertl's death and the conclusion of legal proceedings, the town of Watkins turned its focus toward remembrance and healing. The loss of a 5-year-old girl had left a void not only in her family, but in the heart of a small community that had shared in the grief. One of the first tributes came in the form of a pink bench installed at the local ball field, a place where Elena had often played and where her father had spent countless evenings on the mound. The bench bore her name, etched beside an image of angel wings. Families gathered there frequently, many bringing flowers, notes, or stuffed animals in her memory. In an effort to preserve her legacy in a positive light, the Ertl family launched an initiative called Sharing Elena Ertl's Love. The project aimed to encourage acts of kindness in Elena's name. Local residents embraced the idea, engaging in charitable activities such as donating books to children's hospitals, collecting toys during the holidays, and raising money for shelters. The effort grew to include schools and community groups across the region. Annual events were organized to honor her memory. In her hometown, a charity walk held each August drew participants from across Meeker County. Volunteers wore T-shirts bearing her name and likeness, with proceeds going toward child advocacy organizations and family support programs. The event served not only as a fundraiser, but also as a moment of collective reflection. Local schools incorporated lessons on child safety and community trust, often using Elena's story, presented with care, to highlight the importance of vigilance, empathy, and communication. Counselors visited classrooms to support students and educators in processing the tragedy, many of whom had known the Ertl family personally. The tragedy also prompted discussion among state legislators and child welfare advocates. While the crime had not stemmed from systemic failure, the need to address violence against children led to renewed support for funding crisis response teams and expanding education on recognizing warning signs. Throughout all these efforts, the Ertl family remained publicly present but private in their grief. They released periodic statements thanking the community for its support, acknowledging the strength drawn from the overwhelming outpouring of care. They emphasized that their goal was to channel Elena's memory into something constructive, something that might protect or uplift another child. As time passed, Watkins continued to grow and change, but reminders of Elena remained. Her memorials, her image on community walls, and her story were preserved not only in public records, but in the collective memory of a town that had mourned her together. Though nothing could undo the events of August 2016, the actions that followed, memorials, initiatives, acts of generosity, ensured that Elena's life, though brief, would continue to touch others. Jessica Marie Lunsford was a vibrant 9-year-old girl living in Homosassa, Florida, with her father, Mark Lunsford, and grandparents Ruth and Archie. A third-grade student at Homosassa Elementary School, Jessica was known for her love of singing, her stuffed dolphin collection, and her ever-present smile. On the evening of February 23, 2005, her day had ended like many others: family dinner, a bath, and bedtime. She curled up under her pink covers in the modest double-wide trailer her family called home. Her grandmother checked on her before going to bed. All was quiet. By morning, everything had changed. On February 24th, Mark Lunsford noticed Jessica was missing from her bedroom. The covers were turned down neatly, and there was no sign of forced entry. Her stuffed animals remained undisturbed on the bed. The front door was locked, but a sliding glass door appeared unsecured. Panic set in immediately. The family called 911, and within hours, a full-scale search was underway. The Citrus County Sheriff's Office launched an investigation, labeling Jessica as a missing child. Law enforcement, volunteers, and media converged on the small town. Flyers were printed, search dogs were deployed, and helicopters buzzed overhead. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement issued an Amber Alert. Early interviews with family and neighbors yielded little. The tight-knit community rallied in support, but the lack of clues was unsettling. Investigators examined the possibility of a runaway, but quickly dismissed it. Jessica had no history of such behavior. Her shoes, glasses, and favorite items were untouched. The area was combed inch by search teams. Yet, despite their exhaustive efforts, there were no signs of struggle, no fingerprints, and no witnesses. Every passing hour deepened the mystery and fear. In the days that followed, hundreds of volunteers joined law enforcement to canvass woods, vacant lots, and drainage ditches. Local businesses donated food and supplies. The Lunsford family maintained hope, pleading publicly for Jessica's safe return. Television crews broadcast appeals nationwide. Yet behind the scenes, detectives began focusing closer to home. One fact stood out. Jessica had vanished from her bed, in her own home, without a sound. Whoever had taken her likely knew the layout of the trailer, and how to move undetected. As investigators started digging into the records of neighbors and nearby residents, one name surfaced: John Coey, a sex offender with a criminal past, who was living just 150 yards away. The disappearance of Jessica Lunsford transformed a quiet corner of Citrus County into a national focal point. As dawn broke on February 24th, local deputies established a command post near the Lunsford residence. Dozens of officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers were mobilized. Bloodhounds were brought in, helicopters flew overhead, and divers checked nearby water bodies. Every outbuilding, vehicle, and wooded trail was searched. Despite these efforts, Jessica was nowhere to be found. Television cameras captured the community's response. Volunteers combed the woods in shifts. Children wore purple ribbons in Jessica's honor, and candlelight vigils were held nightly. Jessica's smiling face, framed by dark bangs, appeared on posters, billboards, and news broadcasts across the country. Yet, even as media attention surged, detectives faced a case with few leads and no witnesses. Mark Lunsford appeared repeatedly on national news, appealing to whoever had taken Jessica. His pleas were raw and emotional. Family and friends insisted Jessica would never wander off alone. Her routine was fixed: school, home, singing in church. As days passed, the Citrus County Sheriff's Office received hundreds of tips, some helpful, many not. False sightings were reported in multiple states, and psychics offered unverified visions. None led to Jessica. Behind the scenes, investigators began examining the neighborhood in more detail. Registered sex offenders in the area were scrutinized. Background checks were conducted. Interviews performed. Among those was John Cowie, a 46-year-old man living in a small trailer behind the home of his half-sister, Dorothy Dixon. The trailer was located less than 2 football fields from the Lunsford home. Cowie was questioned early in the investigation. He denied any knowledge of Jessica's disappearance and appeared cooperative. However, his criminal history raised red flags. Convictions for burglary and a prior sex offense involving a child were noted. Still, without physical evidence or a confession, authorities lacked grounds to arrest him. Compounding the problem, Cowie had recently absconded from his registered address without informing the proper authorities, a violation that would later prove critical. As February turned to March, the search continued with diminishing returns. The area had been canvassed multiple times. Despite the proximity of Cowie's trailer, it was not thoroughly searched at the outset. Investigators, working under the assumption that Jessica had been taken away from the area, prioritized leads suggesting she had been transported elsewhere. This delay proved costly. Public frustration began to mount. Questions surfaced about how someone could have taken a child from her home without leaving evidence. Pressure grew on local authorities to expand the scope of their investigation. On March 7th, a new lead emerged. Cowie had fled to Georgia. Local authorities tracked him down in Augusta, where he was staying at a Salvation Army shelter under an assumed name. When detectives confronted Cowie, he initially denied involvement, but inconsistencies in his story began to emerge. Over several hours of questioning, and after being read his rights, Cowie finally began to talk. What he revealed would shatter any remaining hope of finding Jessica alive. John Evander Cowie had lived most of his life in and out of trouble. A drifter by nature, Cowie had accumulated a lengthy criminal record, including theft, burglary, and lewd conduct involving children. At the time of Jessica's disappearance, he resided in a small, cluttered trailer behind the home of his half-sister, Dorothy Dixon, on West Snowbird Court, just a short walk from the Lunsford residence. Although listed as a sex offender, his presence in the area had gone largely unnoticed by neighbors and, critically, had not raised immediate alarm during the initial investigation. In the early days of the search, deputies had visited the Dixon residence. They spoke briefly with Cowie, who appeared calm and cooperative. He denied knowing anything about Jessica and was not arrested or subjected to a detailed background check at that point. The trailer he stayed in, untidy, small, and filled with debris, was not thoroughly searched. This oversight would come to haunt investigators. By the time Cowie was tracked to Georgia and brought in for questioning, Jessica had been missing for over 2 weeks. On March 17th, following hours of interrogation by Citrus County detectives, Cowie confessed to abducting Jessica from her home. He said he had entered the trailer during the early hours of February 24th through an unlocked door and found Jessica sleeping in her bed. He carried her quietly out of the home and brought her to his trailer. Cui claimed he kept Jessica alive for 3 days. During that time, she was held captive in his bedroom while other occupants of the house came and went. Cui told investigators he had tried to keep her quiet, sometimes hiding her in a closet or beneath a stack of dirty clothes. He admitted to sexually assaulting her during this period. On the 3rd day, fearing discovery, Cui said he made a fatal decision. He placed Jessica in 2 plastic trash bags, tied them shut, and buried her alive in a shallow hole near his trailer. She suffocated to death underground, less than 100 yards from her home. Cui led authorities to the burial site, where they recovered her remains. Jessica was still wearing her pink pajamas. The discovery devastated the Lunsford family and stunned the community. Investigators returned to Cui's trailer, where they found Jessica's fingerprints and a mattress stained with biological evidence. A search of the property revealed a pile of fresh soil and disturbed ground. The timeline Cui provided aligned with other evidence, and his confession was recorded. One detail that compounded the tragedy was the knowledge that Jessica had likely still been alive while searchers combed the area just feet away. Law enforcement later acknowledged that, had they executed a full search of the trailer earlier, they might have discovered her in time. Questions about procedure, missed warnings, and coordination between departments were raised publicly. The realization that a known sex offender had been living so close to a child's home and had avoided immediate scrutiny sparked outrage. The community mourned, but the investigation shifted rapidly toward building a legal case. Cui was charged with kidnapping, sexual battery, and murder. The state of Florida prepared for a high-profile trial that would attract national attention. Following John Cui's confession, investigators returned to the small trailer on West Snowbird Court to secure the evidence that would substantiate his account. With the site cordoned off, forensic teams began an exhaustive search of the property. Inside the trailer, they found a mattress stained with bodily fluids, which later confirmed Jessica Lunsford's presence through DNA testing. A closet door bore her fingerprints. Duct tape and trash bags similar to those described in Cui's confession were recovered nearby. The shallow grave where Cui said he buried Jessica lay behind the trailer in a disturbed patch of earth under a rotting piece of carpet. Investigators unearthed 2 tightly sealed black plastic garbage bags. Inside, they found Jessica's body. An autopsy confirmed she had been buried alive. Her arms were folded across her chest, and her fingers showed signs of her attempts to claw her way out. The cause of death was asphyxiation. These discoveries confirmed the timeline Cui had provided. He had entered the Lunsford home undetected in the early morning hours of February 24th, 2005, abducted Jessica while her family slept, and kept her hidden in his room for days. The timeline also revealed missed opportunities. Authorities had searched nearby woods and homes, even the trailers surrounding property, without finding Jessica. By the time Cui fled to Georgia and confessed, Jessica had been dead for over 3 weeks. The role of other residents in the Dixon household came under scrutiny. Dorothy Dixon and her housemates, 2 others living in the home, claimed ignorance of Cui's actions. They insisted they had no idea Jessica was inside the trailer. Investigators considered whether any of them could have aided or concealed Cui's crimes. However, no charges were filed against them. Law enforcement could not establish that they had knowingly participated in or facilitated the crime. Further investigation into Cui's background revealed multiple failures in the monitoring of registered sex offenders. At the time of the abduction, Cui was not compliant with Florida's registration laws and had failed to notify authorities of his new address. The system had not flagged his status in a way that would have prompted early intervention during the search for Jessica. He had a long criminal history and had served prison time for a lewd act on a child in 1991. The Lunsford family, particularly Jessica's father Mark, pressed for answers. They criticized law enforcement and policymakers for the lapses that had allowed Cooey to live so close to a child without oversight. In public appearances, Mark Lunsford remained composed but resolute, pushing for accountability and reform. As evidence continued to mount against Cooey, prosecutors prepared to file capital charges. On March 19, 2005, the Citrus County Sheriff's Office formally charged John Cooey with kidnapping, sexual battery, and first-degree murder. He was extradited from Georgia and held without bond in the Citrus County Detention Facility. The legal process ahead would be long and contentious, but investigators were now confident they had the evidence needed to convict him. With the charges in place, prosecutors began assembling a case that would hold John Cooey accountable for the abduction, assault, and murder of Jessica Lunsford. Cooey faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary of a dwelling with battery, and capital sexual battery on a child under 12. The evidence included his videotaped confession, forensic findings from the trailer, and DNA results linking him to Jessica. Key was assigned public defenders, who soon filed motions challenging the admissibility of his confession. They argued that it had been obtained without legal counsel, present and under coercion. Prosecutors countered that Cooey had been read his Miranda rights and had voluntarily spoken with detectives. The pre-trial phase became mired in procedural disputes, with defense attorneys seeking to suppress key parts of Cooey's statements. Concerns about securing an impartial jury in Citrus County led the court to approve a change of venue. The trial was relocated to Miami, more than 300 miles south of Homosassa, to avoid the intense local publicity and emotional impact of the case. Jury selection began in early 2007. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their knowledge of the case, their views on the death penalty, and their ability to remain objective. The prosecution presented a comprehensive case. Jurors heard Cooey's own words describing how he entered the Lunsford home and took Jessica without waking anyone. Forensic experts testified about the physical evidence found in the trailer, Jessica's fingerprints, DNA on the mattress, and the items recovered from the burial site. Medical examiners described the condition of her body and the cause of death. The timeline of her captivity and burial was supported by decomposition analysis. The defense, while not disputing the core facts, attempted to portray Cooey as mentally impaired and incapable of understanding the gravity of his actions. Psychologists testified that Cooey had a low IQ and suffered from cognitive limitations. They argued these factors should preclude the death penalty. However, the defense did not deny that Cooey had taken, assaulted, and buried Jessica. After hearing weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a verdict on March 7, 2007. John Cooey was found guilty on all counts. The penalty phase followed immediately. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, citing the aggravating factors of the crime: the victim's age, the nature of the assault, and the prolonged suffering caused by her being buried alive. During sentencing, the courtroom heard victim impact statements. Mark Lunsford spoke about the void left by his daughter's death and the trauma his family had endured. The defense again emphasized Cooey's mental state and upbringing, asking for life imprisonment instead of execution. But the arguments failed to sway the jury. They unanimously recommended death. The judge formally sentenced Cooey to death for the murder of Jessica Lunsford. He also received multiple life sentences for the related charges. The courtroom remained silent as the sentence was read, with the Lunsford family quietly embracing. Key was transported to Florida State Prison to await execution on death row. Though the trial was over, the emotional weight of the case lingered. It had exposed systemic flaws in how sex offenders were monitored and raised difficult questions about missed opportunities and justice. For the Lunsford family, the verdict brought a measure of closure, but not peace. Following the death sentence handed down in March 2007, John Coey was transferred to Florida State Prison in Rayford. There, he was held on death row, housed among inmates convicted of the state's most serious crimes. He lived in solitary confinement, with strict limitations on communication and movement. Although the jury had reached its conclusion, the broader legal and emotional reverberations of the case were far from over. Public attention remained fixed on Quee's fate. The case had already become a symbol of systemic breakdowns in the tracking and supervision of known sex offenders. As appeals were expected to follow, Quee's legal team continued to press claims related to his mental capacity and the procedures surrounding his confession. Yet, even among the legal community, there was little debate over his guilt. While the formal appeals process moved slowly, a surprising development interrupted its course. On September 30th, 2009, John Coey died of natural causes at the age of 51. He had been receiving treatment for cancer at the prison's medical facility and succumbed before the state could carry out the execution. His death, occurring only 2 years after his sentencing, brought an abrupt end to the legal proceedings. The Lunsford family learned of Coey's death from prison officials. Mark Lunsford issued a brief statement, expressing neither joy nor sorrow, only that it was finally over. He emphasized that justice had been denied its full course, though the outcome brought some relief. There would be no more hearings, no more appeals, and no possibility of parole or release. Jessica's killer was gone. The community of Homosassa held a vigil in Jessica's memory shortly after Coey's death. Residents gathered at a local church to light candles and reflect on the events that had shaped their lives since 2005. Her classmates, now several years older, remembered her fondly. Though Coey's death had closed one chapter, the loss of Jessica remained deeply felt. In the years following the trial, scrutiny continued over the law enforcement decisions made during the early days of the investigation. Internal reviews examined why Coey's trailer was not searched more thoroughly and how a registered sex offender had evaded detection so easily. While no criminal charges were filed against officials involved, lessons from the case were incorporated into new procedures. Meanwhile, Mark Lunsford committed himself to advocacy. The case had propelled him into the public eye, but he used that visibility to champion reforms in how child predators are tracked and prosecuted. He traveled across the country speaking to lawmakers, police departments, and advocacy groups. His focus was not vengeance, but prevention, ensuring that what happened to Jessica would not happen to another child. Jessica's name became inseparable from debates over sex offender laws and child safety legislation. Though she had been a private child in a small town, her story prompted a national reckoning. For her family, the conclusion of the trial and the death of her killer did not heal the wound, but it marked a point from which they could begin to rebuild. Jessica Lunsford's murder prompted widespread public outrage that quickly translated into political momentum. Legislators, driven by the graphic details of the case and the visibility of Mark Lunsford's advocacy, moved swiftly to introduce new laws aimed at tightening restrictions on sex offenders. In Florida, the response was immediate. Just months after Jessica's death, the state enacted one of the most stringent laws targeting child predators in the country. The statute, widely referred to as Jessica's Law, imposed mandatory minimum sentences of 25 years to life for adults convicted of lewd or lascivious acts against children under 12. It also required electronic monitoring for offenders released from prison and prohibited them from living within 1,000 feet of schools, parks, or playgrounds. The goal was to eliminate discretionary leniency in cases involving child sexual abuse and to ensure closer tracking of convicted offenders after release. Florida's adoption of Jessica's Law became a catalyst for similar legislation nationwide. Within 2 years, more than 40 states introduced or passed laws modeled on Florida's version. These laws often included residency restrictions, electronic monitoring requirements, and increased prison terms. Supporters saw the legislation as a necessary corrective to systemic oversights that had allowed predators like John Cowie to operate with minimal supervision. Mark Lunsford played a central role in this legislative movement. He testified before state legislatures, appeared at public rallies, and worked with child advocacy organizations to push for reform. His efforts helped personalize the issue, shifting the discussion from statistics and policy to the life of a single child. His message was consistent. Existing laws were insufficient, and children deserved better protection. Yet, as Jessica's Law spread, it drew criticism from some legal experts and civil liberties groups. Critics argued that overly broad residency restrictions could make it nearly impossible for offenders to find housing, increasing the risk of homelessness and recidivism. Others questioned the effectiveness of electronic monitoring without corresponding treatment and supervision programs. Some research suggested that laws rooted in public emotion could sometimes lead to unintended consequences. Despite these concerns, the core elements of Jessica's Law remained popular among lawmakers and constituents. In many states, the legislation passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. The image of Jessica, smiling, innocent, and trusting, became a powerful symbol in debates over crime policy. Her story was cited in campaign speeches, political advertisements, and public service announcements. Florida continued to refine its laws in the years following the initial legislation. Amendments increased penalties for violations of registration requirements, expanded definitions of prohibited contact with minors, and provided funding for monitoring technologies. Other states followed suit, often citing Florida's actions as a benchmark. Jessica's case also contributed to broader national initiatives, including the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act of 2006. This federal law created a national registry of sex offenders and standardized notification requirements across states. Although the act encompassed multiple cases and advocacy efforts, Jessica's murder was among the central cases used to illustrate the need for reform. By the end of the decade, the legal legacy of Jessica Lunsford had reshaped the way many states approached the supervision and punishment of child sex offenders. The law that bore her name became both a monument to her life and a flashpoint in ongoing debates about criminal justice policy. For her family, it represented a step toward ensuring that her death was not in vain. In the years after Jessica Lunsford's death, her memory endured far beyond Homosassa. What began as a local tragedy had transformed into a nationwide call to protect children. But for those closest to her, remembrance took quieter, more personal forms. In Jessica's hometown, memorials marked her presence. A granite bench bearing her name stood near her elementary school. At public parks, purple ribbons, her favorite color, became symbols of vigilance and hope. Her family honored her by creating spaces where children could be safe. The Jessica Marie Lunsford Foundation, established by Mark Lunsford, aimed to support victims of child abuse and promote public awareness. Through the foundation, he participated in educational campaigns and supported law enforcement programs aimed at preventing child exploitation. While the foundation operated primarily in Florida, its impact extended nationally through partnerships and speaking engagements. Mark Lunsford's role evolved into that of a national advocate. He traveled extensively, sharing his daughter's story with policymakers, community groups, and families. He often spoke not as a public figure, but as a grieving father determined to convert personal loss into public change. Despite the emotional toll, he remained active for years, appearing before congressional committees and at town halls. Each anniversary of Jessica's disappearance was marked by vigils and quiet remembrance. Friends and neighbors gathered with candles, music, and prayers. Her school preserved artwork she had created, and her former classmates, now teenagers and young adults, often spoke of the impact her loss had on their community. In local churches, she was remembered as a joyful, trusting child who loved to sing and had a special affection for dolphins. Jessica's story also became part of school safety curricula and child protection training. Law enforcement agencies referenced her case in seminars on offender tracking, victim recovery timelines, and interagency coordination. Her image appeared in child safety brochures, reminding families of the importance of vigilance without fostering fear. Though she had no voice in policy, her experience guided the actions of those responsible for protecting others. In time, the Lunsford family moved away from Homosassa. The memories embedded in the streets, the school, and the trailer park were too heavy to carry. Yet their connection to the community remained. Former neighbors continued to maintain the memorials. A local playground was dedicated in her honor. Each time the law bearing her name was mentioned in state legislatures or media reports, it recalled the girl whose life had been cut short just yards from her bedroom. Jessica Lunsford's legacy became one of prevention and protection. The reforms driven by her case changed how law enforcement approached missing children. Her name served as a reminder that the threat to children often lies closer to home than imagined, and that vigilance, accountability, and swift response are essential in preventing similar tragedies. Though her life was brief, the scope of Jessica's influence extended far beyond her years. She left behind no writings, no voice recordings, but she reshaped public consciousness. The systems that failed her became the focus of reform, and the sorrow that followed her loss was transformed into a widespread movement to safeguard others. In remembering Jessica, her community, and eventually the nation, found a shared purpose. Her legacy was not only in the laws written or the vigils held, but in the enduring commitment to never forget how she lived, or how she was lost. In late May 2005, 18-year-old Natalie Holloway from Mountain Brook, Alabama, traveled to Aruba with 124 classmates and 7 adult chaperones to celebrate their high school graduation. The group checked into the Holiday Inn Resort Aruba, located along the island's Palm Beach. On the evening of May 29th, Holloway and her friends visited Carlos and Charlie's, a popular nightclub in downtown Oranjestad. There, she met 17-year-old Joran van der Sloot, a Dutch national residing in Aruba, along with his friends Deepak and Satish Kalpo. The group was seen drinking and dancing together. After the club closed at 1 a.m. on May 30th, Holloway was last seen leaving in a gray Honda with van der Sloot and the Kalpo brothers. She did not return to her hotel room, where her packed luggage and passport remained untouched. Her absence was noted when she failed to appear for the group's scheduled departure later that morning. Upon learning of her daughter's disappearance, Beth Holloway, Natalie's mother, flew to Aruba that same day. She, along with other family members and friends, began searching for Natalie, retracing her steps from the hotel to the nightclub. They also visited the van der Sloot residence in Noord, where Duran initially claimed he had dropped Natalie off at her hotel after their outing. However, surveillance footage did not support this claim, as it showed no evidence of her return. The Aruban authorities initiated a search operation involving local police, volunteers, and assistance from the Dutch military. Despite extensive efforts, no trace of Natalie Holloway was found. Following Natalie Holloway's disappearance on May 30th, 2005, Aruban police began their inquiry by interviewing the last people known to have seen her. Duran van der Sloot and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpoe were questioned early in the investigation. Initially, the three claimed that they had driven Holloway to her hotel and left her there at approximately 2 a.m. However, inconsistencies in their stories soon emerged. While Deepak initially stated that they had dropped Holloway off at the hotel entrance, surveillance footage from the Holiday Inn showed no sign of her return. Furthermore, hotel security did not recall seeing her that night. The account given by van der Sloot also shifted multiple times under questioning. Aruban authorities received pressure from both Holloway's family and American officials. Beth Holloway arrived in Aruba and distributed flyers and posters with her daughter's photo, frequently appearing in the media. She was vocal in her suspicion of van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers, publicly challenging their statements. On June 5, 2005, 2 former hotel security guards were arrested. The arrests were based on van der Sloot and the Kalpoe's implication that the guards may have harmed Holloway after she returned to the hotel. This theory quickly unraveled, and the guards were released within days due to lack of evidence. Subsequently, on June 9, 2005, van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers were arrested as suspects. Their detainment allowed investigators to legally conduct further searches and gather more testimony. During this time, searches of van der Sloot's residence and Deepak Kalpoe's car were conducted, but no incriminating evidence or traces of Holloway were found. Public interest in the case surged as American media began covering the disappearance extensively. Television coverage featured ongoing developments, fueling speculation and increasing pressure on Aruban authorities. As the suspects' stories continue to change, the credibility of their statements deteriorated. Despite significant efforts by both Aruban investigators and volunteers from the U.S., no physical evidence was located. The Kalpoe brothers were released on July 4th, citing insufficient evidence, though van der Sloot remained in custody. Authorities continued to interview witnesses, analyze surveillance footage, and re-examine testimony in the hope of clarifying the events of that night. As the investigation entered its second month, frustration mounted over the lack of progress. Authorities held a series of press conferences, but provided little new information. Van der Sloot, still considered a key figure, repeatedly denied harming Holloway and maintained that he had last seen her near the hotel. Efforts shifted towards broader search operations, including dredging ponds and examining landfills. Divers scoured the ocean floor, while aerial surveys were conducted along the coastline. All yielded no concrete results. By mid-August 2005, van der Sloot was released from custody under the condition that he remained available for further questioning. At this point, investigators faced a case with no body, no crime scene, and no forensic evidence linking any suspect to a potential crime. The absence of tangible leads marked a turning point in the investigation, creating an impasse that would shape the years to follow. Following their initial arrest, the behavior and statements of Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers remained the focal point of the investigation. Authorities hoped that their continued questioning might yield inconsistencies or new evidence, but the suspects frequently altered their accounts, complicating efforts to reconstruct the events of May 30th. Joran van der Sloot initially claimed he had left Natalie Holloway on the beach near the Marriott Hotel after she asked to see sharks. In later versions, he said he had left her alone while she was still conscious and able to walk. Deepak and Satish Kalpoe, meanwhile, denied ever returning to the beach and stated they had dropped Joran and Natalie off near the hotel. Investigators grew increasingly skeptical of the trio's changing narratives. Phone records and text messages were examined. GPS data from the Kalpoe brothers' vehicle was sought, but ultimately yielded no definitive proof of their whereabouts during the critical hours. The lack of surveillance coverage in several areas made corroboration difficult. Joran's reputation on the island began to surface in interviews with classmates and locals. Some described him as charismatic but deceptive, someone known for partying with tourists. Despite the mounting suspicion, the legal standard of proof required by the Aruban system remained unmet. Throughout the summer of 2005, the suspects were rearrested multiple times under varying charges, including suspicion of kidnapping and murder. These rearrests often coincided with public developments or media broadcasts, suggesting new leads, but no new evidence held under scrutiny. Each time, the suspects were released after the mandatory detention period expired. Investigators were also hindered by the limitations of the Aruban legal system. Without sufficient physical evidence, they were unable to file formal charges. The case began to stall, and public opinion became divided. Some believed the suspects were guilty, but protected by legal inadequacies, while others argued that the lack of evidence proved their innocence. By the end of 2005, all three suspects had been released from custody. Joran van der Sloot returned to the Netherlands to begin a university education, while the Kalpoe brothers remained on the island. The investigation remained open, but progress had slowed dramatically. Despite the absence of charges, both the FBI and Aruban authorities kept the suspects under observation. The case had taken on international dimensions, with American officials urging continued cooperation. Intermittent tips and alleged sightings of Holloway from around the Caribbean periodically reignited attention, but none were substantiated. The central challenge remained unchanged: no body, no confession, no forensic trail. As public attention began to fade, investigators were left with a case defined by its silence, by the absence of resolution, and the continued uncertainty surrounding Natalie Holloway's fate. From the earliest days of Natalie Holloway's disappearance, media coverage played a pivotal role in shaping public perception and investigative urgency. American cable networks aired near continuous updates, turning a local Aruban investigation into a story of national concern. This media intensity brought immediate attention to the case, but also introduced complications. Beth Holloway became a central figure in the coverage. Determined and outspoken, she gave interviews daily, calling for justice and repeatedly naming Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers as responsible for her daughter's disappearance. Her presence kept the story alive in the public eye and applied pressure on Aruban authorities, but it also contributed to strained relations between the Holloway family and local officials. As the weeks passed, television segments, panel discussions, and documentaries explored theories and timelines. Speculative narratives often circulated faster than official information. The public consumed a stream of conflicting reports, from alleged confessions to supposed sightings in neighboring islands. This environment amplified scrutiny on the Aruban government. Questions were raised about the competence of the police, potential corruption, and the pace of the investigation. In the U.S., calls were made to boycott Aruba, with public figures and some politicians urging travel restrictions until more was done to resolve the case. Local authorities, facing mounting criticism, continued to assert they were doing everything within their legal framework. They pointed to extensive searches and multiple arrests as signs of their commitment. But without breakthroughs, their reassurances rang hollow to many observers. Media outlets often replayed interviews with suspects and aired reenactments of the night in question. Joran van der Sloot, in particular, became a figure of obsession. His past, demeanor, and family background were dissected across broadcasts. At times, he gave interviews denying involvement, further stirring public interest and debate. The relentless coverage led to misinformation and fatigue. Rumors circulated about secret recordings, police incompetence, and alleged witness intimidation. Social media, though still emerging in 2005, played a growing role in amplifying these narratives. In Aruba, the local population responded with a mix of sympathy and frustration. While many supported the search for Holloway, others expressed concern over how the case was affecting the island's image and economy. Tourism declined temporarily, and officials warned against the portrayal of Aruba as unsafe. Despite the constant attention, tangible developments remained elusive. Beth Holloway made multiple trips to Aruba, often accompanied by media crews. The FBI maintained a presence, but no progress could be publicly confirmed. The case remained at a standstill, locked between conflicting statements, missing evidence, and growing skepticism. By the end of 2005, Natalee Holloway's disappearance had become one of the most widely covered missing person cases in American media history. Yet the truth remained out of reach, buried under layers of speculation, retracted statements, and unanswered questions. By early 2006, the Holloway investigation had reached a critical impasse. Despite extensive efforts, Aruban authorities had not discovered a body, weapon, or forensic link implicating any suspect. The legal system, grounded in Dutch law, required significant evidence to bring charges. Without it, detentions could not be extended indefinitely. Investigators faced significant procedural hurdles. Although they continued to question Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers, the suspects were no longer in custody. Surveillance efforts and re-interviews yielded no breakthroughs. Every promising lead, whether a tip from the public, a rumor about a burial site, or a reported confession, ultimately led nowhere. Under Aruban law, suspects could only be held for a limited time unless new evidence emerged. The revolving door of arrests and releases frustrated the Holloway family. The absence of a declared crime scene or forensic material weakened the case further, making it nearly impossible to build a prosecutable file. Efforts expanded beyond Aruba's borders. With the FBI's cooperation, the investigation tapped into resources in the U.S., including behavioral analysts and crime scene specialists. Despite these efforts, no new physical evidence was found. Underwater searches were conducted using sonar and divers, targeting specific areas based on tips, but all ended without result. The legal framework posed another challenge. Although suspects were considered persons of interest, they could not be indicted without probable cause. The case lacked critical elements: no murder weapon, no verified location of death, and no eyewitness testimony of a crime. Tensions between the Holloway family and Aruban authorities intensified. The family, particularly Beth Holloway, continued to advocate publicly and criticized the perceived inaction and missteps of the investigation. Aruban officials, for their part, expressed frustration with the intense media scrutiny and political pressure from abroad. Occasionally, alleged new witnesses surfaced, claiming to have seen suspicious behavior or heard rumors implicating the suspects. Each statement was vetted, but failed to produce actionable leads. Discrepancies in timelines and confusion over specific locations further complicated reconstruction of events. With the absence of concrete evidence, the case began to lose momentum. Media coverage, while still present, became less frequent. Investigators acknowledged privately that unless a body was recovered or a credible confession made, the chances of resolution were low. The Aruban prosecutor's office formally declared the case inactive in December 2007, citing the exhaustion of all leads. While the case was not closed and could be reopened should new evidence emerge, active investigation efforts ceased. Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers were no longer under legal scrutiny on the island. For the Holloway family, the lack of closure compounded their grief. They had pursued every lead and exhausted all official avenues. Though the public's attention had begun to move on, the family's search for answers did not end. The disappearance of Natalee Holloway remained unsolved, an open wound with no definitive explanation. In early 2008, the Natalee Holloway case returned to international headlines, with the release of covert video footage showing Joran van der Sloot apparently describing Holloway's death. Filmed by a Dutch crime reporter, the recording showed van der Sloot in a car, smoking marijuana, and telling an acquaintance that Holloway had collapsed on a beach and died. He claimed he had called a friend to help dispose of her body at sea. The footage was aired publicly and generated immediate reaction. The Holloway family expressed cautious hope, believing it could bring clarity to what had happened. Aruban authorities, however, were constrained. They argued that the circumstances under which the video was recorded, a private conversation while the subject was intoxicated, rendered it inadmissible as formal evidence. Additionally, the story presented in the recording lacked corroboration. No body, witness, or supporting evidence could be tied to the claims. Shortly after the broadcast, van der Sloot dismissed his statements as fabrications made while under the influence. He claimed he was simply saying what he thought the undercover individual wanted to hear. His retraction mirrored previous behavior. Multiple versions of events, each different, none supported by facts. Still, the incident renewed global interest and public frustration over the case's unresolved status. In subsequent interviews, van der Sloot offered further contradictions. In one version, he suggested that Natalee was handed over to someone involved in human trafficking. In another, he repeated earlier claims that he had left her alone on the beach, alive. With each new story, the possibility of uncovering the truth seemed to recede further. The Aruban prosecutor briefly reopened the investigation following the video's release. New searches were conducted, including targeted underwater sweeps and additional interviews. Yet again, no physical evidence emerged. The legal threshold for charges remained unmet. By this point, van der Sloot had become a figure of notoriety. He gave interviews to foreign media, sometimes for payment, and alternated between denial, implication, and silence. His behavior deepened public suspicion, but failed to yield results for investigators. Attempts to extradite him or bring further legal action were hindered by a lack of jurisdiction and the absence of new, verifiable facts. The Holloway family, exhausted by years of retractions and dashed hopes, maintained public pressure. They supported renewed investigations and pushed for justice, but the obstacles remained unchanged. The series of conflicting statements, none of which led to evidence, underscored the limits of the case. Von der Sloot's shifting stories, though widely reported, did not provide legal grounds for prosecution. Law enforcement officials cautioned against building a case based solely on the words of a self-admitted liar. As months passed, the case again faded from headlines. Each confession, followed by a retraction, had become a painful pattern, offering hope and then removing it. The inability to confirm any version of events left the truth obscured by layers of misdirection and deceit. In 2010, the Holloway case intersected with a new crime that reignited international attention. Joran van der Sloot, long considered the prime suspect in Natalie Holloway's disappearance, became the subject of a new investigation, this time in Peru. Earlier that year, van der Sloot had contacted Beth Holloway's legal representative with an offer. In exchange for $250,000, he would reveal the location of Natalie's remains and the details surrounding her death. As part of a sting operation, an initial $25,000 was paid to van der Sloot in Aruba. He provided false information, directing authorities to a house that had not existed at the time of Holloway's disappearance. Based on this act, a U.S. federal grand jury indicted him for extortion and wire fraud. Shortly after the extortion scheme became public, van der Sloot traveled to Lima, Peru. On May 30th, 2010, exactly 5 years after Holloway disappeared, he was captured on hotel surveillance footage entering a room with 21-year-old Stephanie Flores. Hours later, she was found dead, beaten and left under a hotel room mattress. Peruvian police arrested van der Sloot days later near the Chilean border. During initial interrogations, he confessed to killing Flores after discovering she had accessed his laptop and found information about the Holloway case. Authorities documented his confession, and it was used to build the prosecution's case. The murder of Stephanie Flores brought renewed scrutiny to the earlier case in Aruba. Critics questioned how van der Sloot had remained free, despite years of inconsistent statements and suspicious behavior. The brutality of the crime and the circumstances, occurring on the anniversary of Holloway's disappearance, fueled public outrage. In 2012, van der Sloot was tried in a Peruvian court and pleaded guilty to murder. He was sentenced to 28 years in prison. While incarcerated in Peru, he was also indicted by a U.S. federal grand jury for the 2010 extortion attempt involving Holloway's mother. Despite the conviction in Peru, van der Sloot remained a figure of legal interest in multiple countries. Efforts to extradite him to the U.S. to face charges connected to the extortion case were discussed for years, but delayed by his prison sentence in Peru. The Flora case marked a significant shift in how authorities and the public viewed van der Sloot. His conviction confirmed that he was capable of violence. Though it did not solve the Holloway case, it added weight to suspicions long held by investigators and Holloway's family. The developments in Peru re-energized efforts in the United States to pursue justice in any form possible. Federal prosecutors kept the extortion case active, while Natalie's family continued their advocacy for legal action and public awareness. The Holloway case, though officially unsolved, had gained a grim resonance, defined not just by absence, but by the violent aftermath it appeared to foreshadow. In June 2023, Joran van der Sloot was extradited from Peru to the United States to face federal charges of extortion and wire fraud related to the Holloway case. The extradition was part of a temporary agreement allowing U.S. authorities to prosecute him for attempting to extort money from Beth Holloway in 2010. Upon arrival in Birmingham, Alabama, van der Sloot was taken into custody and arraigned on the charges. As part of a plea agreement, van der Sloot agreed to provide a detailed account of Natalie Holloway's disappearance. In October 2023, during a court session, he confessed to killing Holloway on a beach in Aruba in May 2005. According to his statement, after Holloway rejected his sexual advances, he bludgeoned her with a cinder block and disposed of her body in the ocean. This confession was corroborated by a polygraph test administered by the FBI. Beth Holloway and her ex-husband, Dave Holloway, were present in the courtroom during Vandersloot's confession. They listened as he recounted the events leading to their daughter's death. Beth Holloway later described the experience as deeply painful, but also a form of closure after years of uncertainty. She acknowledged that, despite the confession, Vandersloot could not be prosecuted for murder in the United States, as the crime occurred in Aruba. Following the confession, Vandersloot was sentenced to 20 years in prison for the extortion charges. The sentence was set to run concurrently with his existing 28-year sentence in Peru for the 2010 murder of Stephanie Flores. After the U.S. proceedings concluded, Vandersloot was returned to Peru to continue serving his sentence there. The confession marked a significant development in the long-standing case of Natalee Holloway's disappearance. While it provided answers to questions that had lingered for nearly 2 decades, the absence of Holloway's remains meant that some aspects of the case remained unresolved. Nevertheless, the admission of guilt by Vandersloot offered a measure of closure to Holloway's family and brought a degree of finality to a case that had captivated international attention for years. After Joran Vandersloot's courtroom confession in 2023, the narrative surrounding Natalee Holloway's disappearance shifted. For the first time since 2005, her family had a direct admission from the individual long suspected of her death. Though no physical remains had been recovered, the confession filled the void left by years of silence and misinformation. Beth Holloway addressed the public shortly after the hearing. In her statement, she reaffirmed that Natalee had been murdered by Vandersloot, and that this fact, finally acknowledged in a legal setting, brought an end to the unanswered questions. She emphasized that while there would never be full closure without her daughter's body, the legal affirmation of guilt offered peace. Vandersloot's extortion conviction and his confession were seen by many as a form of accountability. The 20-year U.S. sentence, added to his existing prison term in Peru, ensured he would remain incarcerated for decades. Though he could not be prosecuted for murder under U.S. law, the case's resolution represented a moral and symbolic judgment. In Aruba, the confession reignited discussions about the original investigation. Critics revisited the early missteps, delayed arrests, shifting testimonies, and the missed opportunities to secure evidence. For years, the case had strained relations between Aruba and the United States. While Vandersloot's confession provided answers, it also highlighted systemic gaps in cross-border legal cooperation. Media coverage reflected on the nearly 2-decade journey of the case, from a teenager's disappearance on a graduation trip, through repeated arrests, international intrigue, and a second murder. Documentaries, retrospectives, and news specials explored how the Holloway case had changed public discourse around missing persons and international criminal investigations. One lasting impact was the creation of awareness networks and advocacy groups inspired by Natalee's story. These initiatives, often led or supported by her family, work to improve protocols for missing persons cases, especially those involving international travel. The Holloway case underscored the challenges families face when navigating foreign legal systems in moments of crisis. In the years after 2023, Natalee Holloway's name remains synonymous with perseverance in the face of ambiguity. The case had shaped public understanding of media influence, legal limits, and the pursuit of justice without physical evidence. It also reinforced how long justice could take, and how incomplete it might feel even when delivered. For her family, the truth came not through discovery of remains or a courtroom trial for murder, but through the words of the man who had evaded justice for years. His admission, spoken under oath, ended one of the most publicized missing person cases in American history. Natalee Holloway was officially declared dead in 2012, but her story, now anchored by Vandersloot's confession, remained a cautionary tale and a rallying point for change. Her legacy lived on in efforts to support families of the missing and to reform how international cases are handled, ensuring that others might find answers sooner than her family did.